My name is Joyce Freeling. I'm president of Millennials World. Our mission is to engage the generation in a leadership role in shaping the world of the future and providing digital knowledge and skills resources that support our pathway to long-term sustainability. Our millennials are the largest generation in history, 80 million strong in the United States, and the best educated generation we've had. They tend to be purpose-driven, communal, environmentally aware, and digitally adept. We believe in their promise. I would like to welcome everyone here on site, as well as all those who are attending via the live stream. We are fortunate to be able to kick off our initiative here at the Great Hall at Cooper Union, our co-sponsor for today's program. Peter Cooper, founder of the university, was a great believer in education. He saw it as key not only to personal prosperity, but also to civic virtue. As a progressive thinker and a believer in these values, he made the institution free and open to all. When Abraham Lincoln, an unannounced candidate for president of the United States and virtually unknown in New York City, spoke here, the Great Hall made history. Others as diverse as Henry James, Mark Twain, William Styron, and Salman Rushdie have spoken here as well, along with 7 serving and future US presidents. We feel it is appropriate that representatives of a young generation that will play a significant role in shaping the century and making its history are speaking here today on one, if not the most critical issue of our time, climate change and pathways to sustainability that can alter the damage it can bring with it. For the last 10 to 11,000 years, generations have enjoyed a stable climate. That stability has led to the evolution of today's modern society. But the current practices of modern society have now brought about a danger that threatens generations going forward. It is irresponsible to diminish their hopes and aspirations. It is time for us to consider a new social contract, one that looks long possible futures, one the result of no action, the other result of informed, earnest effort, determination, and creative imagination. I believe you will leave today wanting the latter choice. Before I introduce the panel of millennials, I want to give you a little information if you are watching via the live stream. The network is Great Hall. The password is GH_audience. The hashtag is Millennials4, that's the number 4, change, and millennialsworld.org. bit.ly, MW Voices as well. Now I would like to introduce Sophie Kevlahan, a veteran of many presentations with her grandfather, climate scientist Dr. James Hansen, the early warning voice on global warming.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm pleased to speak here today on a topic that we all care deeply about, climate change, a topic that will affect our generation and our children. I've been speaking out about this topic with my grandfather, Dr. James Hansen, known worldwide for his work in climate science and his advocacy for the need to act now and mitigate the impact of global warming. Today, my peers and I want to talk with you about the clear evidence of a warming planet, the potential damage to the world we know, and the key actions working to reduce the level of warming on our planet. I'd like to start with some history to put into perspective where we are today. Even though global recognition of the potential danger to the future has led to greater awareness, the little action done has accomplished practically nothing to mitigate this danger. In June of 1992, the United Nations held an Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. The biggest potential of the summit was an agreement on the Climate Change Convention, which acknowledged climate change and committed state parties to reduce greenhouse gas emissions based on the scientific consensus that A, global warming was occurring, and B, it was extremely likely that human-made CO2 emissions have predominantly caused it. This became the foundation for the Kyoto Protocol, an international treaty adopted in Kyoto, Japan on December 11, 1997, over 20 years ago. While it made some progress, it has remained more of a paper agreement than one that drives action, as painfully little has occurred internationally during this period in terms of a serious response to the scope of the challenge of global warming. The 2015 Paris Agreement is just another version of the Kyoto Protocol, which the US is currently not participating in now. But as long as governments are not fulfilling these reduction goals, whether the US claims to be participating or not makes little difference in how ineffective it will be. What needs to happen is for people to be willing to take on the fundamental problem that the heads of fossil fuel companies have sided with the government for a trade of money and power. Both benefits are extremely short-term and at the highest possible cost, the habitability of our home. And even when this problem is addressed, our polarized political system gets nothing done. This means that it will take the immense pressure and effort of the public to get a solution. We cannot let them draft a protocol or agreement and wait for them to follow it, and when they don't, just make a new rule again. Since 1990, the world's CO2 emissions have increased by 51%, and 42% of the world's CO2 emissions arising from just the USA and China alone. This means that what we do here has the potential to be very effective and actually work. Here is my grandfather, James Hansen, the early warning voice, who has spoken out for the action in the early 80s. The video going on? Yeah.
And what would you do if you knew what I know? The greenhouse effect had been well understood for more than a century. British physicist John Tyndall in the 1850s made laboratory measurements of the infrared radiation, which is heat. And he showed that gases such as CO2 absorb heat, thus acting like a blanket, warming Earth's surface. I worked with other scientists to analyze Earth climate observations. In 1981, we published an article in Science magazine concluding that observed warming of 0.4 degrees Celsius in the prior century was consistent with the greenhouse effect of increasing CO2. That Earth would likely warm in the 1980s, and warming would exceed the noise level of random weather by the end of the century. We also said that the 21st century would see shifting climate zones, creation of drought-prone regions in North America and Asia, erosion of ice sheets, rising sea levels, and opening of the fabled Northwest Passage. All of these impacts have since either happened or are now well underway. That paper was reported on the front page of the New York Times and led to me testifying to Congress in the 1980s. Testimony in which I emphasized that global warming increases both extremes of the Earth's water cycle. Heat waves and droughts, on one hand, directly from the warming, but also because a warmer atmosphere holds more water vapor with its latent energy, rainfall will become in more extreme events. There will be stronger storms and greater flooding. By 15 years later, evidence of global warming was much stronger. Most of the things mentioned in our 1981 paper were facts. I had the privilege to speak twice to the President's Climate Task Force, but energy policies continued to focus on finding more fossil fuels. By then, we had 2 grandchildren. Sophie and Connor. I decided that I did not want them in the future to say, Opa understood what was happening, but he didn't make it clear. Over the next few years, I was drawn more and more into trying to communicate the urgency of a change in energy policies, while still researching the physics of climate change. Let me describe the most important conclusion from the physics. First, from Earth's energy balance, and second, from Earth's climate history. Adding CO2 to the air is like throwing another blanket on the bed. It reduces Earth's heat radiation to space, so there's a temporary energy imbalance. More energy is coming in than going out, until Earth warms up enough to again radiate to space as much energy as it absorbs from the sun. So the key quantity is Earth's energy imbalance. Is there more energy coming in than going out? If so, more warming is in the pipeline. It will occur without adding any more greenhouse gases. Now, finally, we can measure Earth's energy imbalance precisely by measuring the heat content in Earth's heat reservoirs. The biggest reservoir, the ocean, was the least well measured until more than 3,000 Argo floats were distributed around the world's ocean. These floats reveal that the upper half of the ocean is gaining heat at a substantial rate. The deep ocean is also gaining heat at a smaller rate, and energy is going into the net melting of ice all around the planet, and the land to depths of tens of meters is also warming. The total energy imbalance now is about 0.6 of a watt per square meter. That may not sound like much, but when added up over the whole world, it's enormous. It's about 20 times greater than the rate of energy use by all of humanity. It's equivalent to exploding 400,000 Hiroshima atomic bombs per day, 365 days per year. That's how much extra energy Earth is gaining each day. This imbalance, if we want to stabilize climate, means that we must reduce CO2 from 391 ppm parts per million back to 350 ppm. That is the change needed to restore energy balance and prevent further warming. Climate change deniers argue that the sun is the main cause of climate change, but the measured energy imbalance occurred during the deepest solar minimum in the record, when the sun's energy reaching Earth was least. Yet there was more energy coming in than going out. This shows that the effect of the sun's variations on climate is overwhelmed by the increasing greenhouse gases, mainly from burning fossil fuels. Now consider Earth's climate history. These curves for global temperature, atmospheric CO2, and sea level were derived from ocean cores and Antarctic ice cores, from ocean sediments and snowflakes that piled up year after year over 800,000 years, forming a 2-mile thick ice sheet. As you see, there is a high correlation between temperature, CO2, and sea level. Careful examination shows that the temperature changes slightly lead the CO2 changes by a few centuries. Climate change deniers like to use this fact to confuse and trick the public by saying, look, the temperature causes CO2 to change, not vice versa. But that lag is exactly what is expected. Small changes in Earth's orbit that occur over tens to hundreds of thousands of years alter the distribution of sunlight on Earth. When there is more sunlight at high latitudes in summer, ice sheets melt. Shrinking ice sheets make the planet darker, so it absorbs more sunlight and becomes warmer. A warmer ocean releases CO2, just as a warm Coca-Cola does, and more CO2 causes more warming. So CO2, methane, and ice sheets were feedbacks that amplified global temperature change, causing these ancient climate oscillations to be huge, even though the climate change was initiated by a very weak forcing. The important point is that these same amplifying feedbacks will occur today. The physics does not change. As Earth warms, now because of extra CO2 we put in the atmosphere, ice will melt, and CO2 and methane will be released by warming ocean and melting permafrost. While we can't say exactly how fast these amplifying feedbacks will occur, it is certain they will occur unless we stop the warming. There is evidence that feedbacks are already beginning. Precise measurements by GRACE, the gravity satellite, reveal that both Greenland and Antarctica are now losing mass, several hundred cubic kilometers per year, and the rate has accelerated since the measurements began 9 years ago. Methane is also beginning to escape from the permafrost. What sea level rise can we look forward to? The last time CO2 was 390 ppm, today's value, sea level was higher by at least 15 meters, 50 feet. Where you're sitting now would be underwater. Most estimates are that this century we will get at least 1 meter. I think it will be more if we keep burning fossil fuels, perhaps even 5 meters, which is 18 feet. This century or shortly thereafter. The important point is that we will have started a process that is out of humanity's control. Ice sheets would continue to disintegrate for centuries. There would be no stable shoreline. The economic consequences are almost unthinkable. Hundreds of New Orleans-like devastations around the world. What may be more reprehensible if climate denial continues is extermination of species. The monarch butterfly could be one of the 20 to 50% of all species that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change estimates will be ticketed for extinction by the end of the century if we stay on business as usual fossil fuel use. Global warming is already affecting people. The Texas, Oklahoma, Mexico heat wave and drought last year, Moscow the year before, and Europe in 2003 were all exceptional events, more than 3 standard deviations outside the norm. 50 years ago, such anomalies covered only 2 to 0.3% of the land area. In recent years, because of global warming, they now cover about 10%. An increase by a factor of 25 to 50. So we can say with a high degree of confidence that the severe Texas and Moscow heat waves were not natural, they were caused by global warming. An important impact, if global warming continues, will be on the breadbasket of our nation and the world, the Midwest and Great Plains, which are expected to become prone to extreme droughts, worse than the Dust Bowl, within just a few decades, if we let global warming continue. How did I get dragged deeper and deeper into an attempt to communicate, giving talks in 10 countries, getting arrested, burning up the vacation time that I had accumulated over 30 years? More grandchildren helped me along. Jake is a super positive, enthusiastic boy. Here at age 2.5 years, he thinks he can protect his 2.5-day-old little sister. It would be immoral to leave these young people with a climate system spiraling out of control. Now, the tragedy about climate change is that we can solve it with a simple, honest approach of a gradually rising carbon fee, collected from fossil fuel companies and distributed 100% electronically every month to all legal residents on a per capita basis, with the government not keeping one dime. Most people would get more in the monthly dividend than they pay in increased prices. This fee and dividend would stimulate the economy and innovations, creating millions of jobs. It is the principal requirement for moving us rapidly to a clean energy future. Several top economists are co-authors on this proposition. Jim DePeso of Republicans for Environmental Protection describes it thusly: transparent, market-based, does not enlarge government, leaves energy decisions to individual choices, sounds like a conservative climate plan. But instead of placing a rising fee on carbon emissions to make fossil fuels pay their true cost to society, our governments are forcing the public to subsidize fossil fuels by $400 to $500 billion per year worldwide, thus encouraging extraction of every fossil fuel: mountaintop removal, longwall mining, fracking, tar sands, tar shale, deep ocean, Arctic drilling. This path, if continued, guarantees that we will pass tipping points, leading to ice sheet disintegration that will accelerate out of control of future generations. A large fraction of species will be committed to extinction, and increasing intensity of droughts and floods will severely impact breadbaskets of the world, causing massive famines and economic decline. Imagine a giant asteroid on a direct collision course with Earth. That is the equivalent of what we face now. Yet we dither, taking no action to divert the asteroid, even though the longer we wait, the more difficult and expensive it becomes. If we'd started in 2005, it would have required emission reductions of 3% per year to restore planetary energy balance and stabilize climate this century. If we start next year, it is 6% per year. If we wait 10 years, it is 15% per year. Extremely difficult and expensive, perhaps impossible. But we aren't even starting. So now you know what I know that is moving me to sound this alarm. Clearly, I haven't got this message across. The science is clear. I need your help to communicate the gravity and the urgency of this situation and its solutions more effectively. We owe it to our children and grandchildren. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nicole Cresamano, and I am the co-leader of the New York City chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby. I'm just going to talk a little bit about sea level rise. Sea level rise is one of the greatest threats that the millennial generation faces, as more than half of the world's largest cities are on coastlines. Melting ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica are speeding up the already fast pace of sea level rise. At this rate, the world's oceans will be an average of at least 2 feet higher by the end of the century. Even small changes in sea level rise can lead to flooding and erosion. 2 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century would have devastating consequences and effects on coastal cities like Miami and New Orleans. One study estimates that storm surges, floods, and hurricanes could be costing the world $1 trillion a year by 2050. And another puts it at $100,000 billion a year by 2100. The cost of not acting is so large. Imagine what happens if these cities are partially submerged. Many would become dysfunctional. Think about how many climate refugees there'd be from places like Bangladesh, Alaska. Our systems of government would become unmanageable and ungovernable. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew Herrera, and I am a senior environmental studies major at Ramapo College of New Jersey. And I'm just going to talk briefly about the extreme weather threats that are posed by climate change, some of which will be facing us in the future as our generation grows older, but some of which also face us right now. So firstly, to speak on hurricanes, as the sea surface temperatures warm in the Atlantic Ocean and in the Caribbean, they'll be able to sustain stronger storms that can travel farther. And so according to scientists' studies of climate models, even though we'll see less hurricanes on average, we will see many more Category 4 and 5 storms. So stronger storms, such as Hurricane Maria last year, will be more commonplace and pose much greater threats to us. And our last hurricane season, just to add, was 10 hurricanes versus an average between 1981 and 2010 of 6. So we're already seeing more frequent and more powerful storms. And then to speak on heavy rains and deluges, the deluge that we saw happen with Hurricane Harvey is also likely to become more common because as air temperatures rise, they'll be able to hold more water before they eventually rain it all down. And we saw with Hurricane Harvey how the rain stayed and pounded the city for days before it finally subsided. But according to current climate models, an event like that, which around now is about a 1 in 500 chance of happening, 1 in 500 years, will rise to about a 1 in 20 year chance of occurrence by the end of the 21st century. And while Harvey was happening in the United States, India, Bangladesh, and Nepal were flooded by a torrential monsoon season which killed over 1,200 people. It was an unprecedented rainstorm. And now I'm going to speak about droughts. And droughts will also become more severe in places. So while some areas will receive heavier rainfalls, other places, like the western United States, will see worse droughts. And that's because as temperatures warm, areas such as California, Washington, and Oregon, which are dependent on snowpack for their water sources, will lose that snow to more evaporation as the surface of the ground grows hotter. And that water will be lost. I think we all recall California's drought, which lasted up until the end of 2016. But in the meantime, while their drought has subsided, Cape Town in South Africa, as I'm sure many of you have heard, is now currently facing day 0, a day when it will run out of water because of constant evaporation of its main water reservoir due to 2 of its worst droughts on record, which happened in 2014 and 2015. They've instituted some really excellent water-saving measures, and they've managed to push that day back to July 9th of this year. And next, I'm going to speak about wildfires, which are, of course, connected to droughts. So as I was saying, in the western United States, they depend on snowpack and snow melt from the mountain caps for much of their fresh water. But with temperatures warming and winters becoming hotter, that snow is more likely to melt earlier in the year, when in reality it needs to melt in the summer, because by the time the summer rolls around, which is already a dry season, the grass and the brush and the leaf litter on the ground will be much drier, and it will be much easier for fires to spread and continue to burn. And for the clearest example, I would just point back to the Thomas Fire, which burned for over a month from December 4th of last year to January 12th of this year when it was finally contained. That fire was able to burn an area that's about the size of New York City. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Hi, my name is Anna. I'm going to speak today about heat and its effect on health. Okay, so heat waves, also known as heat or hot weather that lasts for several days, is a pervasive natural hazard that exacts a heavy toll on human systems, such as health, livelihood, and infrastructure. They also burden health and emergency services and strain physical infrastructure like energy, water, and transport. Heat waves are an emerging health problem that are only going to increase in the future. If you think of the last few years, we've been experiencing a lot of hot weather, especially over our summer periods, but more even so, even during our spring and into fall. Heat waves can cause severe dehydration and acute cerebrovascular accidents and further aggravate chronic pulmonary conditions, cardiac illness, and psychiatric illness. By 2100, with a rise of 12 degrees Fahrenheit, the Earth would be too warm in some areas to be cooled with air conditioning. With a 21-degree rise, it would put half the world's population in uninhabitable environments. Climate change is affecting our air quality, increasing concentration of ozone, fine particles, and dust. New Delhi schools had to close for a short period because of smog. It affects driving, it affects transportation, and it affects everyday lives. Increase in incidence of hospital admissions when triggered by temperature change. So people are more likely to go to the hospital and need to go to the hospital when extreme weather patterns are happening. Specific pathogens may increase with a temperature rise, which can lead to inadequate hygiene, improper handling of food, and lack of hand washing, which can lead and has led to epidemics of different sorts connected to infectious diseases. An increase in the incidence of waterborne diseases is caused by the frequency of severe rainfall. And they have very devastating impacts on communities that have no infrastructure to deal with such events. The variety of weather impacts have on the sociological being have been very problematically in a lot of people with mental disorders. People with mental disorders are very impacted by the environment, and the environment, of course, impacts us, and we impact our environment. So heat waves and the general aspect of all the things that have been happening recently have caused a lot of change in our environment, and they're only going to increase in the future. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Ariana Freitag and I'm a second-year electrical engineer at the Cooper Union. I'm going to be speaking about the impact global warming is having on our environment and our ecosystems. Global warming is destroying the environment that sustains all sorts of life. As we are producing tons of CO2, we are rapidly cutting down trees and forests that act as carbon sinks, meaning that they take the CO2 that's in the air and convert it to oxygen through photosynthesis. Instead of preserving these forests to keep the natural process of cleaning our air, they are being cleared to get timber for mass production and to open land use for factory farming and livestock production, another source of greenhouse emissions. The clearing of the world's forests stops the natural process of removing CO2 from the atmosphere, as well as opening the door for exploitive industries to just contribute even more to the rising climate change through greenhouse gas emissions. Forests do not only convert CO2 to oxygen, there are other many benefits they provide, such as preventing erosion, contributing to the water cycle by trapping water in the soil, and sustaining diverse ecosystems like in the Amazon rainforest. Currently, forests cover about 30% of the Earth's land, but if the rate of deforestation continues, which is at about 46 to 58,000 square miles of forest being cut down each year, in about 100 years, our rainforests as we know them will be gone. A primary method of clearing land, which is burning, releases about 1.5 billion tons of CO2 each year, and entire ecosystems are having their climate shift, with there now being 4% more water in the atmosphere than there was previously before in the Industrial Revolution. The clearing of our forests is removing this vital carbon sink and is just making the development of global warming happen at a much faster rate. Humans are not the only ones affected by the change in climate. There's extinction that is occurring for many different species. 7% of mammals and 4% of birds are threatened currently due to climate change, and there are about 450 species that are facing local extinction, meaning that within their local ecosystems, populations are starting to be completely wiped out. So it's becoming a really big issue with a lot of species like the white rhino, where they're now mostly living only in captivity. This is really concerning to scientists, especially looking at the tropics, where the most biodiversity of ecosystems occurs. And many scientists are calling this the sixth mass extinction, with in the next 50 years or so, they're predicting that 30 to 50% of species will be threatened. Another impact on the environment is ocean acidification. Ocean acidification describes a process of the ocean absorbing CO2, which is then converted to carbonic acid and is no longer preserving the balance of pH within the oceans, which is affecting many ecosystems. The oceans are currently absorbing about 25% of all man-produced CO2, and since the early 1900s, our oceans have become 30% more acidic. This has caused many ecosystems within the ocean to have mass death. So the Great Barrier Reef in Australia is experiencing something called coral bleaching, which is when the corals they're dying completely. They're becoming bleached, they're losing their colors because the algae on the coral is dying, and then the ecosystems that rely on the algae and the coral are also being completely wiped out. So coral reefs protect the coast from erosion, as well as they are a main factor of tourism and industry within Australia. Coral reefs produce about $375 billion each year just through fishing and tourism industry. So the ecosystems are dying, as well as the people that rely on these ecosystems for their livelihood are no longer having that access. Global warming is changing our environment as we know it and is causing many ecosystems to no longer support us. If we do not change our ways, there will be mass extinction of many species, and humans could very well be one of those species. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Sophie Schneider. I'm a second-year mechanical engineering student at the Cooper Union. I'm here to talk about food security. So the dramatically changing climate is set to have irreversible effects on the state of food security across the world. Food insecurity exists when a certain group of individuals does not have physical or economic access to a sufficient supply of nutritious food. With the drastic effects of global warming, the 4 dimensions of food security, namely food availability, access to food, stability of food supply, and food utilization, are under immediate threat. Short-term fluctuations in food production in semi-arid and sub-humid areas will become more severe and more frequent as a result of the changing climate. In semi-arid areas, droughts can dramatically reduce crop yields and livestock numbers. Most of this land is in sub-Saharan Africa and parts of South Asia, meaning that the poorest regions with the highest levels of chronic undernourishment will also be exposed to the highest degree of instability in food production. Less is known about the role of climate change for food stability and utilization, at least in quantitative terms, but it is likely that differences in socioeconomic development paths will also be the crucial determinant for food utilization in the long run, and that they will be decisive for the ability to cope with problems of food instability. Climate change will also affect the ability of individuals to use food effectively by altering the conditions for food safety and the changing disease pressure from water and foodborne diseases. The main concern about climate change and food security is that the changing climatic conditions will initiate a vicious cycle where infectious disease causes or compounds with hunger, which in turn makes the affected populations much more susceptible to infectious disease. The result can be a substantial decline in labor productivity and an increase in poverty and mortality. All manifestations of climate change, including drought, higher temperatures, and heavy rainfalls, have an impact on the disease pressure, and there is growing evidence that these changes affect food safety and food security. Greater food insecurity could even pose a security threat as competition intensifies for water and arable land. The IPCC report warns about an increase in risks of violent conflicts in the form of civil war and intergroup violence. The decade-long armed conflict in Sudan, the ongoing civil war in Syria, and unrest in Egypt are all examples of how severe drought, internal migration, and economic hardship can lead to devastating instability. Finally, all quantitative assessments we reviewed showed that the first decades of the 21st century are expected to see low impacts of climate change, but also a lower overall income and still a higher dependence on agriculture. During these first few decades, the biophysical changes as such will be less pronounced, but climate change will significantly affect those still more dependent on agriculture and those who have lower overall incomes. In contrast, the second half of the century is expected to bring more severe biophysical impacts, but also a greater ability to cope with them. In order to achieve food security, all four components must be achieved and maintained simultaneously. And while each component of food insecurity is highly sensitive to climate change, it is essential to discuss them as a whole in order to effectively cope with the undeniable changes to our climate and our food supply. Thank you.
Hi, folks. My name is Anastasia Caulfield. I'm an international studies major and human rights minor at Ramapo College. So I'm here to talk to you all about climate refugees and I suppose the effect that climate has on people all over the world. So first I'm going to just read the definition of a refugee according to the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees. So it states that a refugee is a person owing to well-founded fear of being persecuted to reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular group, or political opinion outside a country, and is unable or owing to such fear is unwilling to avail himself of the protection, of that country. So unwilling to return to a country defines somebody as a refugee. But climate refugees are not enmeshed into that category of people that need help and assistance. This is the world that we could be living in. More than half of us could be in danger of food insecurity and a place to live. A place to work. And so I think that it's important to define climate refugees as people that are asylum seekers. There's 25 million people that are refugees, that are refugees that are seeking asylum, but 65 million people are displaced from their homes. So 65 million people are around and could be subjected to foodborne illnesses, death, and death from just not having a place and owning a sense of identity. That is also dangerous for humanity. I think that's important to be an ally. And so I thought that it was interesting that a paper featured in the New York Times states that weather shocks are compelling to people to seek asylum in the European Union. Applications for asylum have increased along with hotter than normal temperatures. Weather shocks between the year 2000 and 2014 on agricultural regions in 103 countries around the globe have been directly influenced by emigration. I really hope that we take time to take the environment and the place that we live in seriously. I think that my peers have covered climate change in a respectable manner, and I appreciate you all being here. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So I just want to talk a little bit more about Citizens Climate Lobby and the carbon fee and dividend policy that Dr. Hansen briefly touched on in the TED Talk we just saw before our panel started. So to go a little bit more in depth with carbon fee and dividend, the idea is to place a price on carbon at the source, either the mine, the port of entry, or the well, because right now it is the public and the taxpayers that are paying for this externality of climate change consequences and adverse health effects. And we need to be putting a price on carbon so that we can transition to a clean energy economy. The idea is to start out at a $15 a ton and gradually increase this fee by $10 a ton each year. So this way it sends a signal to the market that fossil fuel and carbon-based energy will become more expensive over time, and that businesses and companies can invest in research and development and implementation of renewable energy and carbon-free technology. And the important part of the dividend is that it makes it so the policy can be bipartisan. It's not a tax, so Republicans could, in theory, support it and not break their pledge to raise taxes. And it's also important because it protects middle and lower income families from rising energy costs by getting the fee distributed back to them on a monthly basis equally to each American household. The public will be able to afford the increased cost of consumable goods as the cost of energy rises. And they're also incentivized to choose products that are made with renewable energy because those products will be cheaper. So what I love about Citizens Climate Lobby, and again, I co-lead the New York City chapter, and I encourage everyone here to get involved with our group. Robert, who is our outreach and presentation leader, is in the back, and he will, he's raising his hand for anyone who wants to see. He will be signing people up, so I encourage you to go speak with him during a break or afterwards. So what I love about Citizens Climate Lobby is that we work and train people to go and speak with their elected officials about carbon fee and dividend and climate policy. Democracy is not a spectator sport. We can't just vote once every 4 years and expect our government to work for us. We really work to engage people in living democracy and becoming engaged and active citizens. And to me, the most powerful and inspiring thing is when I see people gain their own personal and political power. So actually this coming week, we are going to meet with Senator Schumer's office in the New York City district. We have about 9 of us from our chapter going, and then the next week after that, we are going up to Representative Serrano's office in the Bronx to talk about carbon fee and dividend policy. So we are a very active chapter. We probably have about 50 people who are part of our regular group. We go and meet with our members of Congress down in DC. We meet with them in district here. We do outreach and presentation events such as this, coming to speak with the public. We have a media committee. We have a state action committee. And it's really wonderful to see people getting involved. And I invite and encourage you to all find your local chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby. Thank you for your time.
All right, I'm going to finish up by talking about the federal lawsuit that many of you may have heard of called Juliana versus United States. It's just funded by the organization called Our Children's Trust. In this case, in which I am one of the plaintiffs, our fundamental argument is that young people are guaranteed equal rights and equal protection under the law, similar to civil rights cases. We talk about the public trust argument, and we argue that our constitutional right to life, liberty, and property is violated when the government approves of the mining of fossil fuels and emissions of fatally high levels of CO2 into the air, despite being aware of its damaging effects. I strongly encourage you to go to ourchildrenstrust.org and learn more about the case and support us and Citizens Climate Lobby. There are different things that you can do depending on how much time you decide to put in. On our website, there is a petition that you can sign, but actions, of course, speak louder than words, and we rather see you tagging us or reposting our things on social media, keeping the movement going, rather than seeing your name on a list. So with our social media and website, you can keep up to date on day-to-day events which you can participate in and voice your support. For example, on February 5th, if you've been following the case, that was our original trial date, which had been postponed. There was a social media movement called Rather Be in Court, and people across the country voiced their disapproval and outrage that we weren't in court as planned, and this not only helped everyone within the suit stay motivated, but it brought a lot of attention to the case and it empowered a lot of supporters, which is the kind of energy we're trying to gather up across the country right now. Because even with the lawsuits and rules and proper regulations, no civil rights issue has ever been solved without the pressure of the people to move it forward. So that's where your efforts should be spent, I think. And if you have the most time, I think the best thing that you can do is join your local chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby. And if you're connecting with everything that we've talked about today and it's really touching you, you will fit in perfectly with them and you'll be the most progressive there, in my opinion. Thank you.
Well, you've heard the voices of a generation looking ahead at issues that can severely restrict their aspirations and their dreams going forward. Now we're going to talk a little bit about action in progress now in terms of mitigation and solutions. Next panel.
All right, we're a little bit of a Gorgon-headed monster here, but I will start. We're each going to talk about a different aspect of climate solutions that are underway right now. My name is Miriam Horn. I work for Environmental Defense Fund, and I'm here because I wrote a book called Rancher, Farmer, Fisherman. The subtitle is Conservation Heroes of the American Heartland. It was also made into a film that aired on the Discovery Channel and I think can still be watched in Discovery's archive. I chose Environmental Defense Fund. I've worked there for 14 years, and we make a practice of reaching across partisan lines and working with people who are often written off as the enemy from the get-go. So we have long partnered with large corporations, and we've also long partnered with people who are producing food for the world at scale. So large-scale farmers, commercial fishermen, people in the shipping industries, ranchers, people who often come from conservative communities, who often vote Republican, but who are absolutely essential to stabilizing our climate and securing all of our natural resources for your futures. I will say that I am myself the mother of an 18-year-old, a freshman in college, and I am completely inspired by your generation. Watching the kids from Parkland who are standing up and changing the world gives me tremendous hope. I also, we always use 2050, and I've always thought that was kind of a mistake because it seemed so far off. But when I realized that my daughter will be 51 in 2050, which is younger than I am now, I realize it's really not far off at all. So I commend you all for the work that you're doing. So I'm just going to take a few minutes to tell you about the journey I went on to write this book. I traveled down the Mississippi watershed, which is really the whole heartland of America. It drains almost half the United States. And I chose that geography because, not only because it holds a lot of our natural resources, and it's been absolutely essential to American history, to our rise as a global power, but also because it maps almost perfectly with red state America. And a key motivation in writing the book was to push back against the idea that climate action or conservation are somehow liberal issues, democratic issues, blue state issues. They not only are not those issues, conservative and conservation come from the same root, but until we get past the partisan divide around them, we will not be able to actually solve these issues. So what I set out to do was to reveal the reality that there's actually a huge unsung movement in the heartland of people who are raising cattle and crops and who are fishing in coastal regions and out in the deep ocean to protect these resources. So I'll just give you a thumbnail on, my book profiles 5 people. I'll give you a thumbnail on each, and then we'll come back later to questions, I think. So I started in the Rocky Mountains in Montana, the headwaters of the Missouri River, with a cowboy named Dusty Crary. He's a former rodeo champion who, in traveling around to compete in rodeos, saw the utter transformation of landscapes like his, the destruction of America's grasslands, the subdivision of epic old ranches, and the destruction of habitat for big animals, big carnivores like grizzly bears and wolves that actually require the ability to move between mountains and prairie. So Dusty led a group of people who had viewed each other as enemies for decades. He calls me a greenie, but so it was cowboys and greenies and outfitters, hunters, fishermen, and even federal bureaucrats, also not a favorite crowd out in the Rocky Mountains. But Dusty managed to pull them all together and to protect more than 500,000 acres of public and private land that is absolutely critical habitat, and to protect these grasslands that are critical carbon stores and critical habitat. I then moved down to central Kansas with a large-scale wheat farmer named Justin, whose family has been farming since homestead days, and like most large-scale farmers, had plowed and plowed and plowed those prairie soils, which we figured out a few decades ago when we came to understand molecular biology, that we were destroying the most important ecosystem on Earth by plowing up those soils, that the microbes in the soil are the most diverse ecosystem. The soils are the most carbon-rich part of the biosphere, and they're absolutely critical to holding soil, capturing water, and producing food. So Justin is one of many large-scale farmers in the heartland, another Republican who is completely revolutionizing large-scale agriculture. They're not tilling their soils anymore. They're introducing huge diversity. I then went out on the Mississippi River with a barge, the CEO of a barge company, and ended up down in the delta of the Mississippi in Louisiana. Some of you may have seen the New York Times today, has a huge story about the jeopardy to that ecosystem. Both of those, the two characters that I focused on there is a man named Merritt Lane, who's the CEO of a multi-generational barge company, and Sandy Wen, who is a Vietnamese refugee. She fled after the fall of Saigon, and both of them are partners in the largest environmental restoration project in the world, an effort to restore the Mississippi's ability to pour sediments into its wetlands and rebuild its delta, which is, again, an absolutely critical ecosystem for fish and for birds, and provides protection against all of those climate threats that the first panel talked about: rising seas, intensifying storms, acidifying oceans. And then I ended out in the Gulf of Mexico with a commercial red snapper fisherman who has been really instrumental in reforming federal fisheries policy so that the total collapse in marine ecosystems and fish populations has been reversed. In the United States, we've succeeded in reversing overfishing in most of our important fisheries, in large measure because of the model that he set. So these are all pioneers who break every stereotype of what an environmentalist looks like. They are all innovating. They're living on the front lines of these climate impacts. They fully understand our interdependency with each other and with these ecosystems, and they are pioneering solutions that I found really inspiring and that I hope some of you will find inspiring in forging your own path. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Nicholas Sobersack. I'm here on behalf of New York City Controller Scott Stringer. I did not prepare a presentation because I thought we'd be more in conversation, but I'd love to tell you just a little bit about what we do at our office and some of our intersection with climate issues that I think are of interest to us all. I am a policy advisor and a senior researcher to the Controller. I do focus on issues of climate, among other areas of focus. And I think the main relevance of our office to today's climate fight, looking out, seeing the demographic before me, I think would be divestment, which has been an issue that has galvanized the climate movement, has prompted a bunch of energy among young activists and older activists, and brought a whole series of people together to make a concerted call to ending the relationship of our cities, universities, other large institutions that hold sums of money, ending relations with major climate disruptors, the oil companies, the energy companies, and other folks. In early January, my boss, alongside the mayor of New York, Bill de Blasio, in conjunction and partnership with the trustees of the New York City pension funds, which total about $195 billion in combined assets, made a commitment to exploring the process of pulling that money out from a series of about 190 carbon-intensive companies all across the world, those that you've heard of, ExxonMobil, Shell, ConocoPhillips, and those that maybe you haven't, and taking that money out of those companies while simultaneously also launching efforts to put a large sum of our investment pool, we've talked about a number that approaches $56 billion, into green and sustainable energies that will power the future. It's a very long and protracted process full of research, bureaucracy, complicated conversations, But we're excited to begin it, and we're excited to get going on it, because it's time for us to stop looking after the next financial quarter and start thinking about the next quarter of a century, where things are going to look a lot different in this city of us that's ringed with about 520 miles of coastline. And we see the effects already of encroaching tides and greater storms and the urban heat island effect. And it's our responsibility as a city to do everything that we can to bring a greener future, to protect ourselves against the dangers of climate change. My boss, Controller Scott Stringer, for those of you in the audience that aren't intimately aware of what a controller is or what a controller does on a daily basis, which I'm guessing is the vast majority of the people I'm looking at to now, I still sometimes sort of struggle to figure out what we do, but he is charged with looking after the economic well-being of our city. We look after the city's books. We look after this giant pot of money in our pension funds. And so it's absolutely critical from our perspective that the city invests now, immediately, to try and stave off some of the harms that can come from climate change. A piece of research that we published 2 years ago that I was proud to take part in, so we actually overlaid a map of the new flood zones within our city. This map is sort of being contested now, but it's a pretty good barometer of what climate scientists expect that we can see in terms of inland coastal flooding within our city. We overlaid it on a map of property values to sort of, quantify what's at stake, to make a dollars and cents argument for how resilient we need to get and what we need to do to stave off complete climate disaster. And what we found is that in this city that I assume that we're all living in, $128 billion of property sits in the front lines of climate change. And it's an abstract way to talk about it, for sure. It ignores the fact that it's not just buildings and real estate, it's human lives, and it's indeed the very character of our city that's at stake. So I would be happy to answer questions about our divestment work, about our environmental record, and about what the city is doing. But I just wanted to introduce myself. Thank you so much.
My name is Jonathan Cloud, and I'm happy to be here today to speak about a number of projects that we're involved with. I'm the executive director of a nonprofit called Possible Planet. We started with a primary focus on clean energy finance, and so I'll talk a little bit about the PACE program, which we hope to get started in New Jersey this year. And we were incorporated originally as the Center for Regenerative Community Solutions, because that is what we ultimately think is part of this, the answer to this problem of climate change. But over the years that we've been working on this, we've also acquired a couple of other projects that we are the fiscal sponsor for. And one in particular addresses a number of the issues that have been talked about today. It's called the Global 4C project, and it's about financing the reversal of climate change. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit as well. First thing to tell you is I'm not a millennial, as you can obviously tell, but I do have a daughter who is 28 years old. And so this is very important to me for personal reasons as well as for lifelong political reasons. I've been working on this problem, I just figured out, for the last 46 years. Started with the OPEC oil crisis in 1972. I was a young person hired into the Canadian government under Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, the previous Trudeau to the one that's currently running the country, who was a very progressive individual as well. And I got involved during that period in energy and environmental policy, and immediately, or almost immediately, became disillusioned with what government could do. And so I left the government traveled a little bit, tried to decide what I wanted to do with my life, and ended going back to Ottawa in Canada and starting a company to build passive solar homes. Because it seemed to me that the solution was not primarily a matter of coming up with alternative technologies, but it was a matter of rebuilding the world in a way that made sense. If we look at the way that we build and have been building for the last 100 or so years, it's really very irresponsible and disconnected from the actual environment in which we live. And so that kind of got me interested in the question of how ought we to be building homes and other buildings. And along the way, I learned to be a builder. I became a real estate developer. Gradually, over a period of time, moved into the area of finance because it was clear to me that even though I'm not an economist by background, that economics is really the key driver of the problems that we have and potentially the key solution to the problems that we have. So our first project, as I mentioned, has to do with clean energy finance. How many people here have heard of PACE, Property Assessed Clean Energy? So just a couple. I'll give you a very brief description of it. PACE is a program that started in California in about 2007. It was developed by the chief of staff to the mayor of Berkeley, where all good ideas start, I imagine. And he came up with an idea for using municipal bonds to help people finance improvements to their homes and buildings, because he realized that the problem is not that people don't want to be environmentally sound or to have buildings that are energy efficient, but there's a capital cost involved. There's a requirement to invest in these improvements, and a lot of people just simply don't have the capital. And if they do have the capital, they often have other uses for it, which are important to them as well. And so he felt that if it was possible to make financing available to people on a long-term basis, they could actually realize the potential savings for making these improvements to their buildings. Probably a lot of you have heard that if you put solar panels on your building or if you do energy efficiency upgrades, there's a certain payback period for that investment. It might take you 5 or 10 years to pay back the investment. Well, a lot of people don't have that amount of time to wait for the payback on an investment. And a lot of people don't know whether they're going to keep their buildings for that length of time to where they actually can have a sense that they're recouping the money that they're putting into improving their property. So the idea of PACE is that if a third-party investor provides all of the capital needed to make the improvement, 100% of hard and soft costs for these improvements, and the repayment of that is spread out over 20 to 30 years, then you can begin to realize some of the benefits, some of the profits on that investment right away if you're the property owner, because your payments on the improvements will be less than your savings from the energy efficiency or the production of solar. So that really was the origin of PACE. There is now PACE legislation in 33 states, including the state of New York and actually including the state of New Jersey. Unfortunately, in a number of these states, as is the case in New Jersey, the legislation doesn't work and has to be amended before the program will be successful. We started working on this in 2012 after the passage of the first PACE law in New Jersey, and immediately discovered that it was not workable because of certain features that had been built into the law by well-meaning legislators, but who did not understand what it was going to take to make this work. And every subsequent attempt to amend the legislation, and we've been through 3 or 4 of those, was rejected by Governor Christie, a Republican who initially acknowledged the existence of climate change right after Hurricane Sandy, but then promptly seems to have forgotten about it in the interest of trying to get the Koch brothers to finance his presidential bid. So he frustrated us for the past 6 years. And we learned a lot more about the legislative process than we ever intended to or wanted to. We're now at the point, thank goodness, that we have a new governor in New Jersey, Governor Phil Murphy, who is committed to clean energy and who has indicated to us that he intends to sign the amending legislation which will make PACE possible in New Jersey. And we just had a market study completed by a consultant in Charlottesville, Virginia, and the conclusion was that there is a potential for investing approximately $129 billion in New Jersey over the next several years to improve the existing building stock, and that's simply commercial, industrial, multifamily residential, but not single-family homes. And if anybody takes the time to look into a little bit more about the PACE program, you'll realize that the residential portion is a huge opportunity as well. In California, in fact, it's probably 3 or 4 times the size of the commercial market. Over the last couple of years, people in California have invested, I believe, in excess of $3 billion in upgrading their homes. Now, it's also quite controversial because it does attach obligations to the property, and so there's some concern about what this will do to homeowners who really don't necessarily understand that what they're doing is mortgaging a piece of their future in order to get some benefits now and over the long term, savings in energy and reduction in carbon emissions. So in New Jersey, one of the things that we've decided and the legislature has decided is that we're going to implement commercial PACE first, try and make that work, and that's the potential $129 billion market, of which we actually expect to perhaps be able to achieve 0.1% over the next 5 years or so, which would be about $129 million, somewhere in that range. So that's the primary project that we're working on. But in addition to that, along the way, we were approached by an Australian civil engineer who had been working on the Great Barrier Reef and had begun to see some of the signs of the climate impact on that. And so he started trying to learn about this a little bit more, went to one of Al Gore's presentations as it happened in Istanbul, and came up with an idea that he thought might have some relevance, and which, along with our help, he has developed over the past 5 years into a policy proposal for central banks and international financial institutions. And I just want to mention briefly the logic behind this proposal, because you heard something about the fee and dividend program earlier, and that's a very important concept, but it is, in my view, woefully insufficient. And so you should be aware of why it is insufficient and what is really going to be needed to begin to reverse climate change, if that's what we as a species can achieve over the next 30 to 50 years. The essence of the fee and dividend proposal is that it's a kind of a tax on fossil fuels. It's a charge on fossil fuels. It recognizes that there are social costs to our burning of fossil fuels and tries to recoup some of those externalities, as economists call them, by charging a fee and then by redistributing that fee to ordinary citizens so that they can cope with the increased cost of consumer goods, as was mentioned earlier. The problem with that is that it does not do anything to address the challenge of investing in the solutions, the kind of thing that I was talking about earlier with improving buildings, with fighting to reverse the consequences of climate change. Some of you may be aware of a book by Paul Hawken that's just been released called Drawdown, which talks about approximately 100 technologies for reducing the carbon in the atmosphere, because it's not just a question of stopping putting more CO2 into the atmosphere. We actually have to remove some of the CO2 that's already there. As Bill McKibben would point out, we need to get to around 350 parts per million instead of the over 400 parts per million that we have now. Well, all of that's very important, but the challenge is how to finance the transition to a sustainable world. And the current estimate of that cost is approximately $90 trillion over the next 15 years. Needs to be invested in technologies and improvements and in changing the way that we live and operate all of the systems in our society. And where is that $90 trillion going to come from? Well, governments certainly don't have it. Most of them are bankrupt. Most of them are incapable of raising the taxes and costs that it's going to take. And so we need to find some other solutions. And what Dr. Chen, who is the project leader, has really investigated at great length is that in addition to the social costs, the actual externalities of carbon emissions, such as wildfires and floods and hurricanes and so on, there is a risk cost in addition to that, which any insurance company, analyst, or economist who's worth their salt would understand is the cost of avoiding catastrophe, the catastrophic effects of climate change, not just on the planet and the species who live on it, but from an economic point of view on the economy. Central banks and world financial institutions have a responsibility to try and make sure that our economy does not collapse as a result of the severe impacts of climate change. But we know that if we allow climate change to continue, if we continue business as usual and we let the temperature rise above 2 degrees Celsius or more, which currently seems to be the expected projection, that we're going to face potential catastrophes that will destroy economies as well as ultimately us. So if we take into account that risk cost, which is part of that $90 trillion, the way that he has devised to begin to put that into circulation is through a process called green quantitative easing, which is the ability of central banking institutions to print money when that is needed to be invested in portions of the economy. We did that during the financial crisis in 2008. The Federal Reserve instituted quantitative easing. But what we need to do now in the face of the crisis that we're addressing is to institute a quantitative easing that is specifically directed at reducing carbon, financing all of the technologies in the drawdown study. And the way to do this without arousing political opposition to a great extent, which carbon taxes and even the fee and dividend have been stymied by, is to do this in the form of incentives for the solutions that we want. So it's basically built on the premise that it's not just the polluter who has to pay for the damage that's been done, it's the beneficiaries, which is all of us, who have to pay for countering those damages and restoring the earth to a balance in which we and other species can continue to live in a way that's harmonious. So thank you very much.
Good afternoon. My name is Toby Cumberbatch, and I'm a teacher at the Cooper Union. I seem to be a little bit out of step here. I got an email from Joyce much earlier in the week, and she said, "What are you talking about?" And I thought, talking about? I thought I was just part of a panel. So I prepared a presentation. And originally, I thought we all had an hour, so I thought 1 hour divided by 3, that's 20 minutes. And this morning I woke up and thought, sounds a bit long, so I got in touch with Joyce and she said 10 minutes, so I will do my best. So imagine walking a couple of miles balancing this basin of filthy water on your head. Fortunately, we don't need to imagine such scenarios. If we want water, we just turn on the tap and out comes fresh, potable water. We accept this as easily as we do the fact that nearly 20% of the world's population doesn't have access to clean water. Worse still, we piss into our pure water. I'd like to talk about the women who bear the brunt of extreme poverty, those who live on less than $1 a day, those whose day begins at sunrise and ends at sunset, the women who carry wood and water to earn a few cents to feed and clothe their children, the women who are resilient and resourceful, who know how to live with the land, who epitomize the dispossessed and the forgotten of our society, who can really teach us about sustainability. Now, will this work? Oh, yeah. So it's a shame that Sophie's grandfather couldn't be here today, because I would love to meet the man who persuaded his co-authors and journal editors to print the sentence you see on the screen. If it doesn't scare the living daylights out of you, it should. Extreme weather events, as we know, are nothing new. The difference is the frequency of such events. New York City is now predicted to experience major floods every 2 years. 5 years, beg your pardon. Last April, I was driving down a road in northern Ghana, crisscrossed with ravines and potholes. Looking out of the window, the African countryside looked as it always did, startlingly beautiful in the failing light. Look a little more carefully, and the paths are dotted with women walking home in the dark, often barefoot, many with babies, almost all with a basin of something on their heads, be it grain, water, or everything you need for a market stall. All was normal. Then my smartphone vibrated. It had found a signal and gobbled up some data. To tell me what? Probably nothing important. I continued looking out of the window, and I don't know why, but all of a sudden the plight of these women overwhelmed me. I was in a car on my way to food, water, and a bed, and probably more bandwidth than I would ever need. My smartphone had absolutely no connection to this environment or the people in it, and I'm an electrical engineer. I first went to Ghana in 1958 and was introduced to the African woman. Large item on head, baby on back, often pregnant. I came back in 2001, nothing had changed and everything had changed. There was a tarred road, some electricity, and people looked much healthier. The landlines were as intermittent as ever, and there was no cell service. The industrialized world had computers, the internet, and obesity, but the African woman had barely changed in 4 decades. 13 years later, mother and daughter still tread the same path. Oh, man. We can't get technology right. Yeah. Large cities in Africa have become unrecognizable. There are cell phones, Pizza Huts, burgers, and shiny new cars. Walk a few yards beyond the end of the dirt road in 2017, and nothing has changed in centuries. Whilst these women may be trapped in the cycle of intergenerational poverty, I believe they can save us. Let's look at a small part of their lives. Here's a young girl at a borehole, surrounded by lots of empty basins. It's the dry season. The water trickles out, and it takes a long time to fill these basins. The women wait patiently in line, often for many hours. Sometimes they fight for water. They may arrive home well after midnight, only to rise again at 5 a.m. and start all over again. But they have no option. They can't just give up and go home because there will be nothing to drink and it's hot. Everyone's thirsty, and it's difficult to cook without water. I'd I'd like you to imagine carrying 100 pounds of water on your head for a few miles. Add a baby on your back, you're possibly pregnant and it's very hot. Oh, and you might have no shoes and you'll probably be hungry. We wondered how far women carry water, so we went to Kadiri in northeastern Ghana and followed water. The size of the pot represents the size of the community, and the thickness of lines represents the quantity of water. In the dry season, everybody must go to the main borehole, over a mile for some. In the rainy season, those near the river can clearly have a much shorter walk. The problem is the water's dirty. It's shared with livestock, it's contaminated. It then becomes a trade-off. Do you carry clean water for over a mile, or dirty water for a few hundred yards and accept an upset stomach? Which would you choose? Let's look at energy, not energy in the way you or I think about it, but the energy that's available to the extreme poor, wood. Everyone knows that wood's disappearing. They can see the tree line receding and must walk further and further. But somehow there's nothing to be done about it. If you want to cook, you need heat. If you want bottled gas, you can't afford the deposit, let alone the content. With a grant from the NSF, we tracked wood over a period of 3 years. 5 a.m. every morning, we spread ourselves out around the village. As soon as we spotted someone with wood, we followed her to the wood market, a small patch of dirt in the middle of town. On the social scale, the wood carriers are the lowest rung. They really are the extreme poor. We got to know these incredible women. We got to play with their children, understand a bit about their lives, and gradually gain their trust. They took us to where they harvested the wood. They explained how they chose which branch to cut to ensure the tree lived as long as possible. They cried with laughter as teaching our students to carry these ungainly loads. Unlike a town in the industrialized world where these red lines might represent electricity and gas, these supply lines comprise women acting as human mules. I doubt anyone in this room can imagine walking 5 miles with 85 pounds of wood on their head and then selling it for $1. Yeah, a single buck. With this tiny amount of money, these women will go to the market and buy the absolute necessities for their family. Then they'll turn around and walk back home to collect water, work in the fields, wash clothes, cook, or whatever other household chore needs attending to. The next morning, they'll get up and they'll do it all over again. It's a life we cannot begin to imagine, yet at this very moment, there are hundreds of thousands of women carrying wood and water on their heads around the world. What happens when a major piece of infrastructure fails in the US? No problem. Someone comes along with a big machine and fixes it. What happens if there are no machines? Do you just accept the situation, in this case a breached dam, or do you fix it with the resources at hand? There is no choice. You dig dirt and you pay around 300 women 75 cents an hour to form a female chain gang and fill the hole. What would you do? Strange as it may seem, this brings us back to the smartphone. Africa is now covered with cell phone signals. But what do smartphones do for these women who carry wood and water? Virtually nothing. Sure, there are cheap phones with simple apps that bring important information to these outlying communities. And we shouldn't forget they provide a vital communication link, especially in case of emergency. But in some ways, anything that works in the bush is an unintended outcome. The apps are mostly inaccessible for these illiterate women, and where can you even charge the phone? Engineering in the industrialized world does nothing to address the lives of the extreme poor. The hundreds of millions living in poverty are not part of our engineering curricula. Somehow we manage to put our energies into innovations that make us lazier and lazier and more dependent upon the Internet of Things. We don't think about where food and water come from. We don't focus on clean energy supplies. We don't teach the smart engineering that nature uses every day, the principles that ensure perfect harmony and unity throughout our living, interconnected planet. We turn on a tap or go to the grocery store. We flick a switch and we get light. But as Sir James Lovelock wrote 10 years ago, we can't keep going like this. Business as usual will be the end of us, whatever we do. There's a conflict between humankind and the planet. We demand more than the planet can supply. We need to go back to James Lovelock's Gaia and treat the Earth and everything on it as a single interconnected organism. We need to live as one. In the USA, we laud lead and other such nonsense which do so little to address overconsumption in any meaningful way. We tag what should be the norm as green and think we're saving the planet. Let's imagine a different world, one in which there is a global dialogue between the rich and the poor, one in which the mighty giants in Silicon Valley address real problems. What if Apple, Microsoft, Google, Facebook, and all those others focused on the grand engineering challenges, such as the provision of food, water, energy, and reduction of waste? What if these masters and mistresses of innovation sought to reduce rural depopulation and shrink the gap between the rich and the poor? Such household names could change the way we think about the world and provide hope that we really can work together for the common good. Facebook reunites old friends, and Google flies airships across parched terrains to provide the internet to people who are starving and illiterate, neither fill an empty belly. When these companies change their priorities, to whom should they look for advice? To the arrays of academics distributed throughout our universities? To the World Bank, the UN, or any global institution? No. They should look to people like this peanut farmer in Jarapa and women like her who really know how to live with the land. They are resilient and resourceful, else they will not survive. Is the way she farms the most efficient? Is it the most productive? Perhaps not, but her farming is much more in harmony with the planet than our industrialized agriculture. Because she's doing more with less, she takes more care with what she does. She cannot afford to waste precious food. She doesn't have access to or cannot afford pesticides and fertilizers. She must use what's at hand. What else of the backwards technology still practiced in these remote rural areas? There are innumerable ways of collecting and storing water, farming and storing food, to name but a few. These are grain houses in Endi, Mali, on the edge of the Abandiagara escarpment. Believe it or not, they'll keep millet in good condition for 2 years, edible for 3. They're made of mud, wood, and a bit of straw and driven by the sun. So much for us to learn from these simple structures used for millennia. So much space for real innovation that looks to nature for inspiration, that thinks about design for place and culture. Looking south from the top of the Bandiagara escarpment, one sees a barren landscape, sandy soil scattered with small communities extending for thousands of square kilometers. And people have been living here for thousands of years. No FedEx or UPS. If you want something, you make it from what's at hand. Is everybody here starving and thirsty? Of course they're not. They're all fit and well. I often wonder what would happen if we were placed in this environment. Would we be able to survive? The question might arise sooner rather than later. As we've all heard, our supplies of natural resources are running out at a faster rate than most realize. Access will be severely curtailed. Climate change has arrived earlier than expected. We need to think seriously about our food and water. But back to the present. This is Francis Kerry's primary school in Gando, Burkina Faso. It's the most beautiful building in the world, as far as I'm concerned. And the only way to get there is to walk 5 kilometers through the bush. There isn't even a dirt track. It was built in 2001 using local resources. Where needed, the community were taught how to use modern imported materials. But the incredible thing is, it looks as good today as the day it was finished. In fact, it looks incredible and it functions beautifully. We spent a couple of hours sitting in a class, plenty of light, a cool and tranquil space, no electricity, no HVAC, daytime temperatures often in excess of 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Would we have thought of such a solution? Probably not. I said we had to learn a lot from the women of Africa, especially at 5:30 a.m. in this tranquil community that derives just about all it needs from the surrounding countryside. As an engineer, I feel compelled to work with these communities to help make their lives more comfortable. But seeing what a mess we've made, we need to learn to do better from these women who can teach us how to survive with far fewer resources, to do so much more with so much less. We squander natural resources as though they're limitless, the same resources they conserve, because they understand the life support system that Mother Earth provides. They're already coping with climate change. The rains no longer come in the month they used to, and when they start, no one knows whether it's the start of the growing season or whether it's just a shower. It's even worse when the rain does come. It comes down in torrents, washing away the seedlings, rushing off to the nearest stream and failing to recharge the aquifers. Situation is urgent. As economic disparity increases, so does the tension in the shanty towns in the less industrialized world. Climate change and scarcity of resources are accelerating the rate of rural depopulation. Major unrest is becoming more frequent in the self-organized communities of the poorer cities, where rising temperatures, insecure food and water supplies push people to extreme behavior. In 2050, it's projected that 65% of the world's population will live in cities. To me, that's a terrifying thought. How will we drive them? These women, tough as nails, are able to support their families and communities in the most extreme circumstances. What have you taken away today? Pity? Empathy? Or have you looked far enough ahead to see yourself in these images? I hope so, for then you'll realize where we are and just how much these women can teach us about living with the land, conserving resources and doing more with less, a new way of doing things. They can teach us about real innovation that uses technology for the benefit of all, how to ride life's ups and downs, how to become one world. Most important, we bring this learning back to the classroom, to the corporate boardrooms, the factory floors, and the inner cities. We change the way we teach engineering, we change our priorities. We strive to eliminate inequity, eliminate the cycle of intergenerational poverty, use our natural resources more wisely. We learn to live with the land, not off the land. You must and you can take the lead. It's your planet. You cannot rely on the old white men. They're too busy saving an extinct way of life. Look to the folks who live simpler lives. Look to nature, the supreme engineer. Design naturally driven systems to support human life. Thank you.
I'd like to take a minute, particularly to thank this panel. They may appear to be in very different venues in terms of the work that they're doing, but they're all sharing one pathway, and that pathway is to move toward a world of sustainability, each in their own way. We're in a time in history, a very important and critical time, because we're in an era of a fading industrial era, which was a very mechanistic period of time. We're now shifting to an era of sustainability, and that can only happen with more people who are focused on these kinds of directions, each in their own area, each in their own venue, doing everything they can to both educate people and to make some progress toward action. Are there any other things you'd like to talk about?
I mean, I'll pick up on a theme from the last talk, which is this idea of Thank you. I just wanted, well, two things. One, to just make sure that you guys know about EDF's own millennial effort, which is called Defend Our Future, which is another, and we also have something called Mom's Clean Air Force, which is another vehicle, both of them vehicles for young people who want to get activated on climate. We also operate something called Climate Corps, which is a training program for MBA students where we actually embed them in companies to do cost-benefit analyses for sustainability initiatives, and many of them now have become kind of the next generation of sustainability officers in these companies. I guess just to stir things up, I can say that I agree and I disagree with you. I agree that emulating nature is absolutely critical in thinking about how we use our natural resources and how we produce food. The farmer that I talked about, his model is the prairie. He tries to make his farm as much like the prairie that he inhabits as he can. He leaves all the old dead plant material to protect the soil. He keeps something alive and growing on the soil at all times. And he tries to create habitat for the organisms that live there before we ever busted out all that sod. I would actually disagree that traditional farming methods are always a great choice. Looking at that stripped bare soil is painful to me. I think I'm a great believer in that we're in a great school of engineering and technology. I'm a great believer, as are you clearly, or you would not be taking your skills there, all of this cutting edge science that we're developing is actually one of our greatest assets. That the reason that these farmers in Kansas can move, they talk about how they're moving along a spectrum from chemistry to biology, that increasingly they're relying on biology to solve problems, not chemistry. And the only reason they can do that is because of the science of biology, because we can see into these worlds that we couldn't see into before. By the same token, companies like Google, they certainly have done plenty of harm in the world, but they also are often lending their leverage in the world for good. We have a project with Google, a methane mapping project, where we've put methane detectors on every Google vehicle that is out in the world so that we can find where this potent greenhouse gas is leaking and address those leaks. So I just wanted to, I guess, make a shout out for the education that you're all getting and what the generational change that I saw when I was coming down the Mississippi watershed, and the transformation that the younger farmers and the younger ranchers and the younger fishermen were really driving. I think we're all really counting on you.
Well, Joyce also asked me to be the moderator, so I guess I get to ask the questions. So my first question to the three of you is, are we too late?
Well, I certainly hope not. Let's try that one. Maybe that's now working. Okay. Well, I certainly hope not. I think that one of the things that I see, I have to say that when I was growing up, I was much more of a pessimist than I am now. I actually was quite reluctant to even consider the possibility of having children, because I thought that I'd be bringing children into a world that was in the process of decay and decline. Because I grew up with rivers on fire, with pollution, as bad as what we see now in Beijing, in LA, and in other Western capitals. The remarkable thing is that we've found ways to address those problems during the course of my lifetime. And I believe that we can find ways to address the climate crisis as well. And that it's not just a crisis, it's also the greatest opportunity that humanity has ever faced. And that if we address this crisis to the extent that we need to, we'll actually produce a world that is much better than the world that we live in today. And we'll do that because we have to, not because it's a good idea, but because it's the only way in which we're going to survive and enable other species on the planet to survive. So that's my reaction to the question.
I'm being called on. I'm afraid that I am not a climate scientist. I'm not someone with any particular insight into ongoing climate models. I leave that up to the people uptown, the Goddard Space Institute. I leave that to the people that are far smarter than me and equipped with many more PhDs. I know that it is my responsibility on the behalf of City Controller Scott Stringer to be treating every day like it's an opportunity, like there is an imperative to correct actions here in the city, to pursue policies that fix some of these problems. I think you're absolutely right to say that there's opportunity embedded in this challenge, whether it's to erase some of the existing health inequalities that you see with old heating systems in New York that are belching out choking smog that are causing asthma, but are also polluting the climate. So finding solutions that address those situations is the work that we do. I will say that on behalf of my boss, Scott Stringer, who, I am actually very privileged and honored to work for, because I think he's very honed in on these issues and very focused in on them. It takes a lot. It takes, really this whole city to build coalitions, to get movement on these issues. And progress has been slow. It's been stalling. We've gotten to a place where we're in imminent danger. We're in danger of these storms. We're in danger of reaching thresholds where cycles perpetuate the harm that keeps on happening. And so I'd only say to whatever audience I'm speaking to everybody in this room that, it's absolutely imperative that we keep going, that you put pressure on elected officials, you demand that they're accountable to your future and the future of this planet, but also that we work together to identify things that we can fix and things that we can tangibly change.
And I would just add, sitting next to someone with a lever of the size that you have to use to change the world is really reassuring, and I would just urge you to focus on those places where change can really happen at that magnitude. I mean, New York has been really fortunate. Mayor Bloomberg continues to be out in the world helping transform cities all over the world to be more climate sustainable and supporting a move away from coal. Our Attorney General has been driving really important fights to step in where our federal government is failing us right now. And I just, to take heart from people who are taking these extremely powerful institutions and using them as a force to move us forward should be reassuring.
I don't know whether anybody saw the New York Times this morning, but there's a long article on a small town in Louisiana, and they're debating whether or not they have to leave it. I certainly agree with all my colleagues, but I guess I'm more pessimistic because I see a lot of inertia. And that brings me to my next question is, can we achieve what we need to do through incremental change, or do we need to be much more aggressive?
Well, I don't know about aggressive, but I do think that we need a profound transformation in our consciousness. And it's not just a matter of incremental change in the way that we do business now. We know that if we continue to do business the way we are doing and continue to be driven by the economic arguments that we are, subject to, that we likely will not find the solutions we need. I think that where we connect is in the sense that all of us as human beings need to recover our relationship with the earth, with Gaia, as you described, and to look at everything that we do every day from the point of view of our responsibility to the environment that gave birth to us. And that if we don't look at it that way, if we continue to be blinded by short-term objectives, however well-meaning we are, it will not be sufficient. So what's needed in terms of the coming transformation is a transformation in consciousness. And I think that occurs at the level of kind of global awareness and global thought, and that it's beginning to shift, that in just about everyone that you will read on any kind of intelligent level on a global basis is recognizing this. And there's a clear line of demarcation between those people who are busy resisting and those people who are forward-looking and are trying to bring that consciousness to the majority of the population, because that's what we need.
Yeah, I would just offer up this perspective. I mean, when we talk about climate change and its effect on our daily, lived experience, we know that the results can be cataclysmic. We know what is to come. We have a pretty good idea of that. And it seems insane, I think, just like instinctually, to think that why aren't we doing these things? Why aren't we going? And why aren't we going faster? Why aren't we going farther? Why isn't there a solar panel on top of every roof? Why aren't we making drastic cuts to growth? Why aren't we doing X, Y, and Z? And that, that's a question that we have to grapple with. It's hard because achieving change is hard. And I say this as a mid-level bureaucrat sitting in the back of a city, city office building in a cubicle. Even something, for instance, I spoke a little bit earlier about our divestment campaign. The city controller, I think it was a big deal. The city controller and the mayor, alongside the trustees from our pension funds, made a commitment to studying divestment. There were many in the community that were very pleased by that result, and there were some that, were interested in faster results. But when we look at, just to use this one particular issue as an example, when we looked at divestment, we of course have the same interest that everybody else does in preserving our planet, but we also have other obligations to handle. This $195 billion pension fund isn't just a pot of money. It represents the future retirement savings of about 700,000 city servants who depend on that money. And it also is constrained by a whole series of laws and regulations that dictate exactly what you can do with that pot of money. And so when we come out and we say that we are going to study this issue, that we are going to look at it, people, sort of raise an eyebrow and talk about incrementalism and talk about, well, why aren't we moving faster? Why aren't we seeing a change immediately? And I would only say that this is a scenario where the people that are looking at this, we get it. We understand that the temperatures are rising, that the ocean is encroaching on our shorelines, but you still have to get from A to B to C to D. You have to do the hard work of every day, changing policies, participating in politics, and that's really, I think, what is going to require the energy of everybody that's interested in this issue. Making sure that you are not, so focused on, well, I won't phrase it that way. Making sure that you are investing energy in the daily, in the daily fights that matter, that retrofit more buildings or, create more sustainable farmlands that produce food. And if we sort of go inch by inch, I hope we get further.
I'm wondering, are there questions out there from anybody? Yeah. I don't know if that mic works, but.
Okay. So one thing that I kind of personally have grappled with while I've done work with looking into sustainable technology is just the embodied energy that is within all of these innovations that we're currently using. So personally, I hear so much about policy that encourages, the use of clean energy, but then you really look at the clean energy and it's using these rare earth metals that are completely destroying environments just to extract them. And I look at, using energy without necessarily cutting back. We're still living the same life we're living. So I'm curious about what you personally think about the relationship between looking at innovation and the embodied energy currently involved with innovation, and is it worth it now to continue doing these things that are still producing so much waste in our environment just by making them, versus changing lifestyles completely? So maybe cutting things completely out of your lifestyle. How do we grapple with that as a society, especially as a society that's so reluctant to change?
Well, the book I wrote before this book was called Earth the Sequel, and it's the subtitle is The Race to Reinvent Energy and Stop Global Warming. And it kind of was a look across all of the cutting edge energy technologies and the need for the kind of life cycle analysis that you're talking about. I mean, biofuels, for instance, prove themselves to be an uncertain proposition and often a bad bet in terms of the net energy that you are getting out of them. That book led us to participate in EDF to participate in a project that you might want to look at called Pecan Street in Austin, Texas, that really set about tackling that whole system view that you're addressing, and that's an absolutely critical view to think about the whole system and all of the knock-on impacts. And it's true in agriculture, it's true in anything we do, that if you focus too narrowly on something that looks like an obvious good, like eating local, if you look actually holistically, sometimes it's not actually the obvious good. Sometimes it's the lesser option. So in Pecan Street, we had a team that we decided you start at the end of every possible efficiency, that first you make sure every building is efficient, you make sure every transportation system is efficient, that you deal with the waste end first, and that you only move to things like solar panels once you've made sure that you've squeezed every bit of waste out of the system. And then we did actually with the help of NASA, we did a rooftop survey to figure out how to deploy solar panels so that we were in the absolute maximum productivity. And that turned out west-facing in Austin was better than south-facing because their peak electricity use is late in the day when everybody gets home from work and cranks on their air conditioners. And so doing that kind of really deep dive and thinking across all of the ramifications is critical, but I still think in many cases you come out way ahead. I mean, the materials issues are yet another question, and I think increasingly we're synthesizing materials that can substitute for a lot of these destructive materials, but I commend you for thinking that way, but there are projects where people are really trying to think in that really holistic way.
This is a really challenging question in many ways because you can criticize almost anything. And, we're learning to think about cradle to cradle and holistic life cycle analysis and things like this. But just to give an example of one of the things that we in New Jersey are currently struggling with, we have several nuclear plants which represent a huge amount of embedded energy already in the buildings, and where the production of energy from those plants does not create any further carbon emissions. So one of the challenges is that the productivity of those nuclear plants, the profitability is now in question, and recently the whole political structure has been forced to deal with the fact that public service and gas has confronted the New Jersey government with the fact that if we do not come up with an additional $300 million in subsidies to keep those plants running for another 15 or 20 years, we are not going to be able to substitute enough renewable energy for them, and we're going to end up building new gas-fired plants which will produce more carbon in the environment. So, for me in particular, this is a kind of an agonizing choice because I spent the first half of my life fighting nuclear energy for all the obvious reasons, that it creates waste with plutonium that we haven't even begun to deal with yet. But I think on balance where I come out is that we do need to keep these things going. And we need to come up with the money to do it. And it's particularly difficult because that is a trade-off against the idea of investing more in solar. And so what the new governor has done is to try and marry those two things together. He's put together an omnibus bill that includes the $300 million for the subsidy for nuclear, and it also includes a commitment to move to genuine renewables by 2050. So, it's a balancing act, and there's no way around it. We have to deal with the world as it is today and find solutions that are the best solutions we can come up with.
I have no insight into that question.
Well, you know what I think, Ariana. I completely agree with what everybody said, but I think we should push more for complete life cycle analysis. But I also think that one of the things that's so often missing is what can you do with what you've got. We keep saying we need more of this and more of that. And we don't really stop and think, well, you know, can we keep the house a bit cooler by opening a few windows, having a few fans? Can we put on more clothing in the winter? Can we do all sorts of things which actually reduce our demand rather than looking at ways to to deliver, quotes, sustainable demand? So on top of a life cycle analysis, you know, what can you do with what you've got to hand?
Hello. I just have a question for Mr. Silbersack, because at Ramapo we've been involved in some planning for divestment, or talking to the college pension or the foundation investment committee about it. We're still in the early stages, but I was just wondering if you had insight on the process of how you know, convince the relevant people of why divestment was the right choice, or how you arrived at that choice even. And how you go about the process of discussing that, because of course there are people with vested interests here that don't necessarily relate to environmental sustainability, like you were saying before.
Yeah, the point that I was stumbling around before and probably making way too inarticulately is I think you do have to be cognizant of some of those issues. You know, presumably an endowment at a college like that represents scholarship money for people. It represents the ability to safely steward the university through rough times when they come ahead. And, you know, as somebody that sat on the other side of the desk from people that were coming and pushing us to divest, I was always very sympathetic to the aims of all those activists who did tremendous work and continue to do tremendous work and mobilized. And, you know, it's very convincing, especially to a public official like my boss, Scott Stringer, when you're barraged by letters and mailings and all those things. And I don't have to tell anybody about the traditional techniques of that sort of activism. But I would just encourage you to just have these sort of frank conversations, because it's about weighing things. It's about weighing the benefit of divestment, which, you know, in some cases sort of attenuated, because you don't see an immediate impact. When you divest, it's not like suddenly you're, you know, shutting down a coal-fired power plant over there, but it, you know, it does speak very strongly about the direction and the purpose and what is driving us. And you weigh that with what the person on the other side of the table has to deal with, which is probably a lot of bureaucracy, probably a few laws, regulations, ordinances that have to change. And you know, I hope a productive conversation can happen from that. Something that's also tricky too, and again, I hope some of this is interesting, that we sort of had to grapple with is, and this is a place where I think divestment really can catalyze some real change, is a lot of the times it's actually quite hard to know what stake institutions have in carbon-intensive companies. It's not like we have a safe in the office that I work with down by City Hall that you open it up and there's just 1,000, you know, shares of Exxon stock. We invest with all sorts of partners in the financial world. They do the investment work, and we guide them, and we have trustees that look very carefully, and we sort of dictate terms. But hopefully, you know, an opportunity that you can sort of see that might go hand in hand with divestment, and something that our office did last year, is you can say, well, what are we doing to drive growth in renewable energies? What are we trying to do to drive growth in, you know, most places have real estate portfolios, trying to encourage energy efficiency. And so that's sort of a separate side conversation you can have. We decided that we were going to open up a manager search, an investment manager search, which we said there's $56 billion available to investors that come to us and say, we want to invest this money using, they're called environmental, social, and governance priorities. And you know, we've fielded a lot of interest from that, and now a lot more of our dollars both achieve a responsible return, because I need to emphasize that we have to do that on behalf of our retirees and on behalf of the city, because it's everybody's taxpayers' money that funds this pension fund. But while you maintain, it's called your fiduciary responsibility. You throw that at the people across the table from you, and they'll be very impressed that you're right up on that. But while maintaining our fiduciary responsibility, we're also saying we can do positive things to benefit the environment, and we can also move away from an economic system that is, I think, inching towards its demise, because we just can't keep doing what we're doing in terms of our carbon output. I hope that's helpful in some way.
Well, I hope at this point everyone's knowledge is enriched by what they've heard today. And we want to thank the panelists for their telling us with their passion the importance of the topic that we're all here to care about. We're going to take a 10-minute break and look forward to the next panel, which will focus on new pathways to sustainability, new promise for the future. I'd like to introduce our next panel. These are students from Columbia University's Earth Institute. They are all students studying sustainability. They are the ones who are going to help shape our future.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. So my name is Sarah Burns, and I'm currently studying at Columbia at the MPA ESP program, which stands for Environmental Science and Policy. So I wanted to start out with a background about me so that you can hear about how I got interested in the environment. So I'm from Fairfax, Virginia, which is a county along the East Coast. And so in this county, there was not much talk of climate change. And at this time, we didn't seem to be feeling any of it. However, I was fortunate enough to live in the suburbs, where there was ample access to greenery and nature. As a child, however, I didn't feel much connection to plants. However, I was fortunate enough to live in the suburbs, where there was ample access to greenery and nature. As a child, however, I didn't feel much connection to plants and the outdoors. Instead, I felt a connection with my 3 cats at home, which kept me company as a child. This makes a bit more sense when examining how this all ties into choosing to study environmental science. I chose this path because of an interest I developed in middle school as a result of television advertisements I had seen about polar bears losing their homes in the Arctic. As an animal lover, I clung to the notion that by devoting my life to environmentalism, I could make a positive impact on the outcome of the polar bear population. Throughout the years, I became heavily involved with the study of earth sciences, where I was able to give deep thought to the structure of and influencing factors regarding the climate change issue. My first revelation came relatively quickly. In early high school, I asked the question, how can one stop global warming, which we now call climate change? Both of my parents worked for the government, one at federal and one at a local level. So the solution of government intervention immediately came to mind. On a federal level, I thought there must be some kind of legislation that could be put in place to make people pollute less. Even at this relatively young age, I knew that, left to their own accord, people would not make these life changes on their own. This left me to explore environmental science studies with a focus on policy for my undergraduate degree. My second revelation came about when I was attending the University of Pennsylvania, in my second year deciding which electives to take. My thought was, what is both impactful and interests me? The decision came quickly, as energy has always been intriguing to me and is at the root of our fossil fuel emissions that perpetrate climate change. This decision created a shift in my career from which I would not turn back. Although earning my MPA, however, I have now become interested in the private sector, as it is essential to fully understand the public sector. So now that I've explained to you my background, I'd like to share a bit about energy. Energy comes from many sources. The most common sources worldwide are oil, coal, and gas, which are all fossil fuels. Fossil fuels perpetrate climate change, contributing to the disasters spoken about in these earlier presentations. Not only do fossil fuels contribute to this degradation of the Earth by virtue of air quality and the ozone layer, they are also a limited resource and fluctuate in price as a result. Many countries cannot produce their own fossil fuels, and because they do not yet have the infrastructure to produce renewable energy, they must import fossil fuels, which makes them energy dependent. This can be risky as they are completely reliant on other countries who may at any point raise prices or choose to no longer export these resources. When studying energy, I was surprised to find out the great strides that have already been taken to incorporate renewable energy into the electric grid all over the world. One of these specific renewable energy types was geothermal, which is produced using steam from reservoirs of hot water underground to turn turbines. I had the great opportunity to study in Iceland during the spring of 2014 and found that as a result of the country's location on the mid-Atlantic ridge, one of the most tectonically active places on the planet, they are able to derive approximately 30% of their electricity from geothermal sources. This number is staggering in comparison to the 0.4% of geothermal energy produced in the United States. Wind and solar energy are the most popularized forms of renewable energy in the United States and also the fastest growing. For wind power, the natural resource, wind turns the turbines of large pinwheel-like structures to create electricity. On an industrial scale, these structures are typically at least 330 feet tall. In order to increase overall wind electricity production, countries in Europe, including Germany, Sweden, and Denmark, as well as the US, Japan, and China, are operating offshore wind farms, a recent innovation that has the potential to take off even further with the appropriate funding. Iowa is a pioneer state for wind energy, producing approximately 35% of its electricity from the source. So, as mentioned earlier, China is the #1 producer of new renewable capacity in the world. In 2016, China's solar capacity more than doubled and is actually expected to continue to grow at a rapid rate, aiming to increase solar PV capacity by 110 gigawatts from 2016 to 2020. Solar is incredibly appealing because of its ability to be harnessed from the rooftops of individual homes and the incentive it gives homeowners to reduce their electricity bills. I'm sure some of you have heard of the word smart grid before. So smart grids are different from the conventional ideas of an energy grid because of their incorporated digital technology that allows them to have two-way communication between customers and the electricity grid, and the sensing along the transmission lines. If we combine smart grids with renewable energy, we can use less total energy for the same output. This could be the solution to climate change. So we are just at the beginning of one of the largest energy transitions that we will ever see. We are fortunate to have the opportunity to be a part of this transition to clean energy. If you are a millennial or anyone else deciding their career path and this topic is of interest to you, I strongly encourage you to consider entering the energy field. Thank you.
Good afternoon. As Joyce mentioned, I'm a graduate student at Columbia University. My name's Megan Ross. And when I considered what are our pathways to sustainability, I think our collective pathway is really made up of all of our individual stories. And my personal pathway to working on urban sustainability is a little bit of a surprise, and the way I see it is a little bit different, because I spent most of the past 10 years pretty far removed from the urban landscape. After I finished college in Virginia, I moved to Alaska, and initially I was living in a log-constructed lodge beside a river, inaccessible by roads. To pick up groceries required a 45-minute flight in a single-engine plane, or a 2-hour snow machine trip, or a 3-hour boat ride, depending on the season. Everything that we did was dictated by the natural environment and the conditions it presented on a daily or annual basis. I had long loved the outdoors, but my time in the Alaska wilderness and later in its small town of Palmer gave me a new understanding of what it means to live in the world in a way where you are deeply connected to the land and responsive to the conditions it presents. I've had moments in those wild spaces where I confronted the absolute power of the earth and its systems in awe-inspiring and occasionally terrifying ways. It governs everything. And the reason I mention this experience is because, for me, that recognition changed the way I saw my life's work. As my humility and my respect for the Earth's systems deepened, I wanted my work to have more of an environmental significance. In the fall of 2016, I was struck by a profound sense of urgency and personal responsibility to take bold steps to create the kind of world that I wanted to live in. That season was the catalyst that motivated me to reshape the path I was on. When I considered what would be the greatest issue of my lifetime, what was the problem I wanted to solve, climate change was the black cloud hovering over everything else. To live in a truly sustainable world, we need to eradicate racism, sexism, and so many other complex problems that threaten the citizens of our world. But I believe that climate change exacerbates those problems because its effects hit hardest in the communities that are most marginalized, and ignoring the warming world will eventually make it impossible to gain traction on any other issue. So I listened to the part of myself that was pushing for change, and less than a year later, I began a graduate program in sustainability management at Columbia's Earth Institute, shifting my work into mitigating and adapting to the problem of climate change that I know will define our future. So I find myself now in the urban landscape after all that time. New York City is about 1,000 times bigger than the town I moved here from, and that's not an exaggeration, that's based on the numbers. And since I got here, I can't stop thinking about what urban sustainability can signify. We know that New York and Beijing and the other megacities of the world have a remarkable impact on greenhouse gas emissions because of the sheer number of people they support and because of the size of their economies. But they can't be the only sustainable places to live. We need to bring everyone along with us in this effort at every level. And one way to do that is by implementing policies at the state and local levels that bring urban sustainability to small and mid-sized cities. We're drawn to cities because of the economic opportunities they offer, the access to services and entertainment, the diversity, the innovative technology there, and the relative ease of getting around. I'd like to extend those elements in smaller urban areas and establish a culture of environmental awareness and commitment to sustainability so that as those small cities grow and expand, they do so with long-term impacts in mind. If any city serves as an example of sustainability and has a thriving economy and community life, people will want to live there. And it's my hope that cities of all sizes will flourish and remain affordable and accessible. So a lot of these elements that we love about urban communities are major contributors to sustainable lifestyles and great mitigators of climate change effects. By designing dense, multi-use neighborhoods where foot traffic and cycling traffic are optimal modes of transit, we see multiple benefits. By giving people the option not to drive to reach jobs and services, we reduce dependency on automobiles, and if we reduce CO2 emissions, that's good for everyone. Increased pedestrian traffic encourages the patronization of local businesses and bolsters the economy. Neighborhoods where residents interact on the streets and sidewalks become more cohesive as social bonds are strengthened. Being physically active and engaged in your local community is an improvement or leads to improvements in mental and physical health. Implementing bike infrastructure yields many of the same benefits as pedestrian infrastructure. Dedicated bike paths can improve rider safety, and workplace amenities like bike racks or shower facilities can improve the ease of using a bike for your daily commute. Health benefits aren't just limited to the exercise you get on your own by self-powered travel, but the reduction of auto exhaust means less air pollution, better health for communities with fewer missed days of work and school, fewer emergency room visits, and of course, reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Mass transit is a big part of what makes urban areas livable and attractive. By affording residents access to opportunities in a wide range across the city, mass transit boosts the economy by connecting people to jobs and can relieve users of the costs of owning and using a car. Subways and light rail systems are critical to the infrastructure, particularly in large cities, but bus rapid transit systems are also key to transit networks, and they utilize lighter infrastructure and technology to keep them efficient, like dedicated lanes on the road and traffic signal priority. The cost to implement bus transit systems is relatively low in comparison to other mass transit, which makes them a great alternative for smaller urban areas. And walkable, bike-accessible areas don't have to be within large, dense cities either. Even in the small town I moved here from, and in many small towns, well-planned bike paths snaked outward from the town center toward residential neighborhoods alongside the highways for miles. Residents could safely walk, bike, or snowshoe to work, in my case. The reality is that many people who commute without cars do still own cars because the larger distribution of the region might necessitate it, and because biking to work in the pouring rain isn't for everybody. But the important thing is that the infrastructure enables an alternative, because providing alternatives is part of how change is made. It's also my hope that by enabling people to travel under their own power, aside from reducing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, it refreshes people's sense of connection to the earth, whether it's concrete or dirt underneath their feet. Getting out into the fresh air and the weather on a regular basis is what reminds me of my place in the world. I inhabit it, I don't control it. Finding ways to respect that relationship, to reduce our consumption of resources, to minimize our influence on Earth systems, and to rehabilitate our landscapes from the damage we've done is the most important and rewarding work I can undertake. I know there are others right here in this room and out there who are ready to join me in it. But not everyone's pathway to sustainability is the same. We will all be moved into change by different catalysts, at different directions, perhaps at unexpected times. I encourage all of you to listen to what moves you and ask yourself, what is the biggest problem that you think we as a society need to solve? How can you equip yourself to be part of the solution? Whatever that answer is, follow it and let it lead you to a new place.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for staying here so patient and hearing a lot about what we have to say. My name is Andrea Cristina Ruiz. I'm a Master's in Development Practice student at Columbia University School for International and Public Affairs. And I'm also studying climate change adaptation, but in connection with development and recently focusing on forestry and food security. I grew up in Quito and Miami, Quito, Ecuador, Miami, Florida, places that have always been exposed to climate change, just like the world is now. And this impacted my view of the world because it connected me with the environment, but also let me see the different kinds of threats that locations could face. I also studied economics, and I loved science, and I feel like I'm an entrepreneur at heart. So what better way than bring those things together than to study climate change, something that really encompasses so many dimensions, but also lets me be an entrepreneur if I conduct research. So researchers are, in essence, entrepreneurs that are trying to increase knowledge and gain better understanding of the way things work. So I want to combine these things, and there was no better way to do that than in climate change. So I want to talk to you today about forest and food, combining things and thinking about systems and how things work. But not before talking a little bit about diversity, because just like was mentioned before, climate change will affect all people, and in different ways. And usually the most marginalized populations are already at higher levels of risk with less capacity to adapt. And so when we think about climate change and we think about diversity, you see me talking, but it should be everybody who's impacted, and not just us thinking about them, but having them at the table as well. And so with that, I'll tell you a story. Just this January, I was in the rainforest in Peru researching conservation finance, and I remember seeing the most beautiful tree I've ever seen. It was a giant Brazil nut tree. This tree can provide Brazil nuts and is also the source of income for thousands of people who live in the area. But these trees are under a lot of threat, especially from deforestation and agriculture. So usually forests and food have been at odds, but do they have to be? Not necessarily. 25 of the proposed solutions in the book Drawdown talk about forestry and food, many of them together. So I want to walk you through how these things are connected and why they matter, and how we as millennials and people can make a difference in that connection. So 1/3 of the global population today depends on forest goods and services for fuel to cook, for food, or for other non-timber forest products. Yet 3.3 million hectares of forest are lost every year. Where is that connection happening? You'll think about forests and food systems beyond the forest's ability to provide food, but they're also a source of ecosystem services that provide water management and shelter for people who live in and around the forest. So, like I mentioned, forests in and of themselves provide great value. They have ecologic value, economic value, they're beautiful, and they also help restore the natural elements of the ground and fight fight erosion, which is key for agriculture. With innovation in farming, we can prevent the loss of forest land by doing things in a more sustainable way. Because right now, agriculture expansion is the main cause of deforestation. We have a lot of competition between the value provided by agriculture and also the forest. So in addition to things like a carbon price and other things that could help add value to ecosystems that help mitigate climate change and capture carbon, we also need to help it compete with agriculture. So looking at agriculture intensification, for example, is one of the great ways that we can bring them together. We can create more in the space we have without necessarily tearing down the forest that we already have. Conservation agriculture is also important to be able to maintain the health of the land that we're using for many years to come, so doing it more sustainable. And also integrating forests with agriculture, like some of the solutions proposed in the book Drawdown, are an important way of, like the chestnut tree in Peru that I was looking at, provide food, provide nutrients, provide income, and then also allow a sustainable way to get income from the forest and keep the forests where they need to be. Because reforestation is crucial. We need to reforest the land that we've already lost, but we also need to stop losing it. So what better way than looking at agriculture, something that depends on forests, but also something that for so many years has been at odds when it doesn't really need to be. So we've talked about a little bit in the interactions between forests and trees. If you were to remember one thing from this talk, it would be the importance of looking at systems and how these systems work. They're not in isolation. We can't just look at forestry and conservation and agriculture. They're all part of systems that come together and amplify each other when they're not doing well, but also can help amplify solutions when we address them one at a time. And that's what's fascinating about climate change, because it's not one siloed issue. It's something that covers a lot of elements, and that's something that we can leverage to not only address the solutions, but also do them in a creative way that helps us find new futures. So again, we operate in systems, and when these connected systems are acknowledged, then can also be leveraged to address the climate change in the way that we want to do it today. So we've also been talking about millennials, who we are, and most of the time it's people who had access to technology at an early age, and it's also people who are living now, who are coming of age now. I want to challenge you to think of all of you as millennials. You all had technology at some point, and if you're watching this, you either had technology today or you're watching this through technology, and we're all living in the today. And to do something about climate change, we need to all be millennials and all act today and do so in an organized way that helps move action, because this is really one of the most pressing issues of our time, and we interact with it in every way. Just like forests and food interact in every way, we interact with climate change, and that's why it's our mission and it's our job to do something about it. So be educated, be active, and be part of this whole community that needs to do something and has the power to do so. So I'm guessing you can now understand why I'm so passionate about forests and food, and hope that with that you can appreciate forests and food as well, and hopefully in the future read my papers. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Miriam Nielsen, and I'm studying climate and society at Columbia. And forgive me, I am going full millennial, and I have my notes on my phone, so I'm going to pull them up really quickly. I'm going to talk to you really briefly about the importance of and how to communicate about climate science and, more importantly, sustainability. So when I was 15, I stopped eating meat. By 22, I had sold my car, and once I got to live on my own, I took a little extra money and paid it to my electricity provider to make sure all the energy that they gave me was bought from renewable sources. And these are really fun, flashy facts. They give me sustainability cred, but ultimately they've reduced my yearly carbon footprint by a couple tons of carbon dioxide a year, nothing really that'll bring it down to the less than 2 tons per year that everyone needs to be using. So this is kind of the point I find when climate communication and sustainability starts to break down. When individual actions don't feel like enough, it becomes really hard to get people who aren't already excited engaged in the issue. Folks tend to feel apathetic, like if there's nothing I can do, why bother doing anything? Before I went back to school, I worked as a video journalist, reporting on science stories and primarily climate change news. And most of my day-to-day was spent figuring out how to talk to people about climate change in ways that are respectful and engaging and informative, but most importantly, got people to care. Unfortunately, that's pretty difficult because a lot of the real solutions, as we've been hearing today, aren't necessarily flashy. They aren't really driving a Tesla. While those are great, they're not going to save the world, per se. A lot of it's really hard and requires huge societal shifts. We have to start thinking about things differently as systems and how the entire world works together and making sure we are including people of all walks of life and how it affects them. Which doesn't really fit on a bumper sticker very well and makes talking about this difficult. Like any good marketing student will tell you, the most important part of climate communication is knowing your audience. You have to know who you're talking to and what's important to them to be able to get the information across in a way that's actually going to stick and make a difference. So are you at the Thanksgiving table talking to your uncle, in a meeting with your boss, trying to get work travel to be reduced? Are you speaking with young children or writing a blog post? You need a different tool for every single situation. With your uncle, it's probably better to walk him through the false reasoning behind climate denier viewpoints, not just tell them why it's wrong, but the reasons behind, not just tell them that it's wrong, but the reasons behind why those ideas are wrong. If you're talking to your boss, you're probably going to rely on economics arguments. It's a lot cheaper to have an online conference call than fly across the country every couple months. With young children, it's important to be excited and have fascinating new tales about cute little frogs that they can get really engaged and interested in, rather than just lots and lots of stats. If you're writing a blog post, you have to balance being accessible so that new readers will feel included and want to be engaged, while also still being wonky enough to keep the people coming back every day. But knowing how to talk to climate change, once you've figured out who your audience is, the hardest part is then making sure that what you're saying is right. There's a lot of people out there getting very excited and wanting to share all these facts that they're learning, but we don't always have the right tools to know what is important, what is useful. Here we go. There are great resources out there like the Drawdown book that I know a couple people have mentioned. There's also all these useful resources that people have mentioned today, the kind of information that they've been sharing. It's really important to seek those sources out. And then once you are armed with those solutions, communicating sustainability means you don't just have to be a harbinger of doom, talking about how horrible everything can become. You can become more of a peddler of truth and peddler of hope. So I encourage you to go out every day and really talk with people about climate change, because practice is incredibly important, but also that is how we can shape society and culture, which is what we really need to do. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Jesse Thorson, and I'm a fourth-year undergraduate at Columbia. During the next couple minutes, I'm going to briefly outline the importance of story for mitigating climate change and the necessity of narrative if we are to wholeheartedly work towards a common sustainable future. But before I do, I want to quickly thank Joyce Freeling for organizing this afternoon. I'm really excited to be here, and we all are. It's always been important to be attentive to the stories we tell with our words and by our actions. But narrative is becoming increasingly critical for sustainability practitioners as the climate crisis continues. The basic idea I want to leave you with this afternoon is this. We need to develop an image of human flourishing worth sustaining before we can work out the nit and gritty of how we're going to get there, especially in the face of climate change. We need to more deeply consider the stories we're living out vis-a-vis our actions and behavior, and we need to ask whether or not the commitments and values we maintain, often implicitly, are commensurate with true sustainability practice and the possibility of climate change mitigation. We need to be attentive to our storytelling because we are fundamentally storied beings. We live and breathe stories. They give us meaning and a sense of purpose. Whether articulated out loud or embodied implicitly, we all subscribe to stories which give us some understanding of what it means to be human, and we more or less behave accordingly. Such grounding stories are sometimes explicitly religious and include narratives of creation, fall, and redemption. They can also be philosophical or economic in nature. American capitalism, Hegelianism, Marxism, and its variants all tell some kind of story of humanity, including where we're going and how we'll get there. Whether we know it or not, we absorb these meaning-making stories into our lives and our individual and collective consciousness. Stories from our culture matter because they orient us to pursue particular goods, to maintain particular ethical commitments, and to recognize particular conceptions of beauty and justice. Importantly, the stories and myths told in our cultural milieu often affect us even when we do not explicitly accept or acknowledge them. Philosopher James K. Smith writes, quote, "To be human is to be a creature whose form of life is primordially shaped by what one loves as ultimate. We are the sorts of animals for whom things matter in ways that often don't and we can't articulate." Whether expressed explicitly or left unspoken, I would just add that these ultimate loves constitute commitments to stories. They captivate our attention, not only cognitively in our heads, but by the gut and in our hearts. Regarding climate change and other challenges of sustainable development, we are in need of a meaningful narrative which can, one, make sense of the human ability to dramatically affect the natural environment, two, inspire us to imagine a common, sustainable future, and three, equip us with the vision of how it is that we'll get there. We need to stretch our imaginations by telling a new story with new values, or perhaps by retelling ancient stories and reclaiming values millennia old. Whatever such a narrative looks like, whether ancient or modern, it needs to provide us with a sense of where we come from, where we ought to go, and how we should act so as to move forward. For a moment, try reflecting on how you understand your place in your community and the world. How important is the natural environment to your understanding of yourself and where you're going? In a book called For the Common Good, theologian John Cobb and ecological economist Herman Daly rightfully note, interestingly, that the three most important characters in the Hebrew Bible are God, Israel, and the land. We too need a story that gives priority to the ecological system, not merely as a backdrop for the primary plot of the human protagonist, but as a story which gives actual weight to the interrelations and play between human beings, other animal species, and the rest of the biotic ecological community. Indeed, interrelatedness is a value we must acknowledge for a new age of sustainability. But an anthropology for a new era must also hold in tension the distinct capability Homo sapiens have to tend the environment and to work it for good, or conversely, our ability and predilection to wreak havoc on the plants, animals, and ecosystems around us. In theological terms, this is what could be referred to as the human vocation of vice-regency. Suzanne Moser offers a handful of metaphors to describe the possible vocations of environmental leaders in the future. Quote, steward, shepherd, arbiter, crisis manager, perhaps even grief counselor. These examples all go hand in hand with an anthropology that acknowledges the human potential to dramatically alter the world around us. I also suggest that sustainability practitioners need to reclaim what is referred to in theological circles as eschatology. Eschatology is the study of what is to come. It is the study of the ultimate telos to be realized by humankind and the world. We need to ask, where are we going? Where do we hope to end up? What is it that constitutes the good life we actually think is worth sustaining? An analytic of the good life will have to include, but certainly must go beyond, the primacy of community and dignified work. Some might say that the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations offer us a glimpse into what constitutes this good life. Yes, the goals are good and they're quite specific, but they don't really offer us a compelling picture of human flourishing. Rather, they're more like a technical architectural plan for a new house. They give us dimensions and measurements which are necessary components of the finished construction, but they fail to tell us anything about what it actually feels like to inhabit its space, or what it might mean to live well in such a home. In other words, we need an eschatology to inspire hope in the face of climate change, a hope which is not naive and blind, but mature and rooted in truth. As David W. Orr puts it, quote, hope is a verb with its sleeves rolled up. We need a story which provides us with both the possibility of a positive future and an imperative to act so as to see that future realized. Such a hope will be the narrative arc that moves us forward. I've talked about the importance of story and mentioned a few requisite components of a compelling narrative for sustainability. But we still need to ask, how is it that we're going to incorporate ourselves and our communities into such a story? And how do we live it out? We need a mechanism by which this narrative will come to affect our being in the world. Again, following Jamie Smith, I suggest that moving towards a common sustainable future will require us to reclaim practices of liturgy and sacraments. Liturgy and sacraments are, quite simply, the practices that members of a religious community perform on a coordinated basis so as to be formed into a people with shared values and a shared vision for the future. These practices include rituals and rhythms such as singing, moving, reading aloud, eating, and drinking, and they incorporate the fullness of the human sensory experience. So too, I propose, we need intentional practices by which we will be formed into a people who together value climate justice, social equity, biodiversity, ecological integrity, and the beauty of the natural world. One can imagine daily practices of meditation and mindfulness to remind us of the intimate connection between human and environmental flourishing, weekly practices of intentionally reducing our consumption levels, and annual practices of intentional escape from the urban sprawl of our cities. Perhaps even the contemplation of art that testifies to the place of humans embedded in the natural world. Ritual, education, and community, all three are important aspects of what we could call a liturgy for sustainability. Finally, the authors of the well-known Brundtland Report define sustainable development as that which, quote, seeks to meet the needs and aspirations of the present without compromising the ability to meet those of the future. This is more or less the textbook definition of sustainability, and it's good, but it's not enough. Just what are the needs of the future, and why do we care about meeting them? Can we really reduce human flourishing down to the satisfaction of biophysical and economic needs? No, we need a more compelling story. We need to think more deeply about what it looks like to live a good life, and only then can we discuss, debate, and incorporate into our lives the means by which we ought to move forward in the face of climate change. In short, I suggest we need to develop a robust narrative sustainability. Thank you.
Well, those are certainly the passionate and dedicated young voices that care deeply about the future and are going to work to shape it. We're going to take a few minutes to set up the stage for a little art contest or competition, and take the theme that Jesse spoke about, story, a little bit further. We'll take 5 minutes. Behind the curtain there. Go for that. It's actually 195 billion. Oh. It's an aggregate across the state. Yeah, across the different pensions and things, across the different agencies of the city. Because he mentioned it several times, 195 billion. The pension fund is 5 billion. I don't know what other funds they're talking about. But you said it was an aggregate of 195 billion. Okay. Let me tell you. When Jesse spoke about story, we felt it was a very important topic to expand on, to raise the imagination of what a better future for all could look like. As part of story, powerful story, it helps us when there are images that carry their themes through. Patrick and Mike are going to draw a theme, an image that reflects a theme of the day. And while they're doing that, I'm going to review for you some of the images that have had a powerful effect in either coalescing action or capturing someone's imagination or educating the public. In New York City, anyone who knows New York knows this logo. It was gifted to the city by the person we call our emeritus designer, Milton Glaser. He's certainly a designer known around the world. And in his mind, this was New York's story. Its hard lines and its heart. Next slide. This was his transformation of that image after the towers fell. If you look at the heart, you see that it's injured. That was the way we all felt in New York City after the towers fell. And so he carried that image through because it was so integral to the city. Next slide. This is Milton's image for global warming. He's a passionate man about the topic. And in his view, it's killing the planet. This image was put up all over the city for many, many weeks after he designed it. He gets frustrated because he feels that we're not moving fast enough to deal successfully with the topic. And many people concur that that's the case. If we look at some of the campaigns and themes that have been worked on, you can see the serious effort to connect to the public the seriousness of the issue. Next slide. Here's one by the World Wildlife Fund that seeks to communicate urgency. It's very clear that you have dying animals in this image. Next slide. To continuously show the urgency, this one, every 60 seconds a species dies, focuses also on the threat of what's taking place to animal life on the planet. Next slide. This is another one from the World Wildlife Fund. And here you have, again, the dying elephant. But it's more than the elephant, because the title that went with this image is 6,000 species a year are dying because desertification, it leaves them without the water or the plant life to consume to live. Next slide. This is one that was done by the United Nations, and it showcases the result of habitat destruction. You have polar bears living as homeless people in boxes. So it's an effort to communicate what is happening to the home of these animals. And that takes us back to melting polar ice caps and the lack of an environment in which these animals are nurtured. Next slide. This campaign, it's a global warming campaign, is trying to show the effect of emissions on animal life. So it's another way of attempting to convey the critical issue of global warming and what's causing it, which are emissions. So here again, you have a polar bear wearing a gas mask. Next slide. And this is another one that's part of the same campaign, and it's the effect of emissions on very fragile species. And if you recall James Hansen's talk, he spoke about the dying of the monarch butterfly. Next slide. This is sea life. So again, it's the effect of emissions. And so the gas mask is a powerful image of not being able to breathe the air that is needed by life. Next slide. Deforestation, and here by using money rolled up where it looks like a tree stump, but it's really focused on the economics of deforestation. There's the economics that's posed by the people who are cutting down the forests, and then there's the larger issue of the cost to the whole world of deforestation. And so there needs to be a much different approach, a much more balanced approach, and these are the kinds of images that are being used to try to convey how critical the issue is. Next slide. This is a focus on pollution in the oceans. It's not necessarily directly a climate change issue, but it is in terms of the pollution that results, because it's also killing sea life and causing a great deal of damage in the oceans. Next slide. This one focuses on pollution in our air because it's the manufacture of plastic bottles. It's part of the Turn Your Tap campaign. And what it's referring to by its design is the emissions that are produced by manufacturing the plastic bottles. We won't even go into where what those plastic bottles do in clogging up everything, but this is just basically for manufacturing the plastic bottles. So the focus here is to use tap water rather than water in plastic bottles. Next slide. Next slide. This is an image that was done on a poster for Hong Kong. This is actually an egg timer. And it's focused on the urgency that's posed by flooding because of the rising sea level. Hong Kong's an island, so it's the rising sea level, and it's showing some element of flooding beginning on the island. So again, these are all images of urgency, which is today's story. The urgency is to capture people's attention to understand how critical climate change issues are and how relevant they are. Next slide. Measuring your carbon footprint. The Carbon Trust did this very large, huge image of a foot, and within that image, they put lots of information on how to find out more, where you can learn about it, and so on. But it makes its point about carbon footprints and what the costs are relevant to what we as individuals contribute to the warming cycle. Next slide. There's also the cartoon messages. Now, this is sort of a takeoff on a gas mask, but it's done a little bit differently, but at the same time, it certainly conveys a message. You know what they're saying. Next slide. This is an Earth Day image, and it's done as a reminder of what the planet means. It is the mother of all life in that it is our habitat, and it's where all life comes from in terms of the home we live in. Next slide. Next slide. So we're looking at, on Earth Day, the effort to convey the message of how important a healthy habitat is to our lives. In order to maintain or secure or develop or reach a healthy habitat, because we don't have a healthy habitat right now, we need a cultural shift. And we need to develop new narratives, we need to foster new leadership, we need to place a new value on natural systems, we need to strengthen our value for community, we need to invest in thinking long-term, and we need to value our obligations to successor generations. This is a cultural shift because we're accustomed to thinking in very short term in what's immediate, as opposed to beginning to look long term, to see ourselves as part of a system of life, and to see ourselves more as a community of people who are part of that system of life. Next slide. So we need to get to this point where the Earth Day image is a happy habitat. So we love our mother and we have made our home healthy, where she's certainly proud, smiling. How are we going to get from here to there? Our goal now is to invite millennials to step into the future through a social media competition using several platforms where they can begin to consider and post their vision of leadership for the directions going forward, their new narratives of what that world can look like, their new images for that world. The competition will have monthly winners on each platform, and each theme will be partnered with a graphic designer to create an image for that theme, and carry the winners' names. The social media competition will begin on March 24th and run through the end of the year, through December 24th, the day before Christmas. We have campus posters, which can be requested as well. Next slide. So all winning presentations will be showcased online. They'll be featured in media stories. They'll be assembled in a DVD and sent to congressional representatives and Fortune 1000 business leaders. We want them to hear your voice. We want them to know who you are and what you want for your lives. They'll also be celebrated at a New York, Washington, D.C., and Los Angeles event. So we invite all millennials to participate in this social media competition, to stay tuned, to sign up on our website, millennialsworld.org, so that you can get email alerts on the competition and any new activities that are added. Next slide. So we are speaking to millennials and mentors alike because this should really be transgenerational in terms of how we create new stories. So civically engaged citizens' voices matter, their actions matter, their stories matter, their images matter. They will all make a difference on the shared journey to shaping a sustainable world. I think that's the last slide. Yeah. Okay. So our artists are working on an image of the day that reflects what they heard in the various presentations. And we're just doing some rough sketches. And we're going to put them up online for you to comment on them. If you like what you see, we will have these images transformed into t-shirts or posters. This will be the result of your thinking on this. We invite your participation. And we invite your participation in the social media competition because it's the future that you need to step into through your interest, your actions, your understanding of the topic, and its relevance to your lives. Anybody have anything finished? No.
Mine's more abstract right now.
Okay. Okay. You want to talk about it? Talk about it.
Hello, everybody. This would be my quick abstraction of what was discussed today, incorporating the Millennials World logo of the millennial generation, moving forward and upward to combat the creeping climate change that exists. This represents the climate change. This is sort of the planet, and this is the forward-moving action to combat climate change. Thank you.
Great. Patrick, how you doing? All right, well, come and talk about it.
Yeah. So my idea was pretty simple. I heard some stats. Originally I thought it was 5 billion, but have fossil fuel oil dripping away. It says divest 195 billion in the funding.
Okay. So the 2 points that our artists today have felt that are the most important are 1, actions and movement, and the generation being the driving force, and the economic impact that the divestment of New York City, for example, there are others across the country, but certainly New York City has one of the most powerful funds because of its size and scope. And it's not just the pension funds, but many other funds that are joining in the divestment initiative. And that's a statement by itself. So I thank you both, that was great. And we'll put them up online and align them with the speakers so you can see how they translate that energy into an image. Thank you.